in the Red Keep, in the chambers of the Hand of the King, Ned Stark holds a book that will destroy a dynasty. The book is old, a record of great houses, their bloodlines, their marriages, their children. And the page he is reading describes a pattern so consistent and so damning that the man who discovered it before him was murdered for it. Every Baratheon who has ever married a Lannister has produced black-haired children. Every single one. And the 3 golden-haired children sitting in the royal nursery are not Robert Baratheon's children at all. Ned Stark knows what this means. He knows what happened to Jon Arryn when Jon Arryn learned the same truth. And he knows that the next decision he makes, who he tells and when, will determine whether he lives or dies, and whether the 7 kingdoms burn or hold. This is that story. The Hand's discovery Jon Arryn died for this. That was the thought that crystallized in Ned Stark's mind as he sat in the Tower of the Hand on a warm King's Landing evening with the Book of Lineages open on the desk, and the evidence arranged before him like the pieces of a case that a judge would present to a court. The book, The Lineages and Histories of the Great Houses of the 7 Kingdoms, was the last book that Jon Arryn had been reading before his death. The last places Jon Arryn had visited were the workshops and brothels where Robert Baratheon's bastard children lived and worked. The last words Jon Arryn had spoken, according to Grand Maester Pycelle, were, "The seed is strong." The seed. The Baratheon seed. The black hair, the blue eyes, the heavy jaw. The Baratheon features that dominated every cross with every other bloodline, generation after generation. The genetic stamp that persisted through marriages with Targaryens and Estemonts and Florents and, critically, Lannisters. Every Baratheon Lannister union in the book had produced dark-haired children. Every single one, stretching back 100 years. Joffrey was blonde. Myrcella was blonde. Tommen was blonde. 3 golden-haired children in a line of unbroken dark-haired children. 3 exceptions to a pattern that had no exceptions. 3 impossibilities sitting in the Red Keep and calling Robert Baratheon father. They were not Robert's children. They were Jaime Lannister's children, Cersei's twin, the Kingslayer, the Golden Knight of the Kingsguard, who had been at Cersei's side for the entirety of her marriage, and whose proximity to the Queen had produced what proximity and inclination always produced when the barriers of law and decency were insufficient to prevent it. Ned set the book down. The study was dark, the candles burning low, the fire reduced to coals, the light insufficient for the weight of the information it illuminated. He had spent 2 weeks following Jon Arryn's trail through King's Landing. He had visited Gendry, the boy at the blacksmith's shop, dark-haired and blue-eyed, the image of Robert at 15. The bastard whose face was the proof that Robert's seed produced dark-haired children regardless of the mother's colouring. He had visited Barra, the infant girl at the brothel, another dark-haired Baratheon bastard, another confirmation that the pattern held. The pattern held for every child except the 3 who mattered most. The 3 who sat the royal nursery. The 3 who would inherit the Iron Throne. Ned's hands were flat on the desk. The hands were still, the Northern Lord's discipline preventing the trembling that the discovery's magnitude demanded, the body holding its composure through the force of will that Ned applied to every crisis, and that the crisis was testing to its limits. He had to tell someone. The question was who. The obvious answer was Cersei. Warn the Queen. Give her time to flee with her children, to escape Robert's wrath before the wrath descended. The mercy was the Stark instinct, the impulse to protect children, to spare innocence, to extend the grace that power permitted and that Ned believed power demanded. But Jon Arryn had known this truth, and Jon Arryn was dead. The official account was fever, a sudden illness, a rapid decline, the fragile health of an old man succumbing to the pressures of governance. The official account was a lie. Lysa Arryn's letter to Catelyn had said as much. The Lannisters murdered my husband. The specifics were unclear. The motivation was not. Jon Arryn had discovered the truth about the children, and the truth had killed him. If Ned warned Cersei, he would be the second man to confront the Queen with her secret. The first was dead. The pattern was as clear as the pattern in the book, and the pattern said, Men who gave Cersei Lannister time to act did not survive the time they gave. Ned would not warn Cersei. The decision was not cowardice. It was the recognition that mercy extended to a woman who murdered her opponents was not mercy. It was suicide with moral pretensions. Ned Stark valued honor. Ned Stark also valued breathing, and the combination of the two demanded that the truth go to the one person who had the right to hear it and the power to act on it without being murdered for it. Robert. The truth belonged to Robert. Robert was the king, the wronged party, the husband whose wife had betrayed him with his own Kingsguard, and whose children were not his children, and whose dynasty was built on a lie. The truth was Robert's, and the telling of it was Ned's duty, as hand, as friend, as the man who had ridden south because Robert asked him to, and who had discovered, in the investigation of Jon Arryn's death, the reason Jon Arryn had died. Ned sent a servant to request a private audience with the king. The request was for the following morning. The morning was chosen because Robert would be sober in the morning, or as close to sober as Robert ever achieved, and the conversation that Ned intended to have required sobriety the way surgery required clean instruments. The servant returned. The audience was granted. Tomorrow morning, the king's solar, private. Ned closed the book. He locked the book in the desk drawer. He went to bed and did not sleep, because the bed was a horizontal surface and the surface could not prevent the vertical thoughts from standing in his mind and demanding attention. Robert will want to kill them. The children. Robert will want to kill the children. The thought was the fear. The truth was the weapon. And the morning was the battlefield. The truth and the king Robert Baratheon was eating when Ned arrived. The king's solar was a private chamber on the upper level of Maegor's holdfast, the room where Robert conducted what little governance he personally attended to, which was minimal, and where Robert consumed the food and wine that constituted the primary activities of his post-rebellion existence. A plate of cold bacon sat before the king. A cup of wine, Arbor Gold, the morning vintage that Robert pretended was not drinking because it accompanied food, sat beside the plate. Robert was large. Robert had been large when he swung a warhammer on the trident and ended the Targaryen dynasty. Now the largeness was different, the muscle converted to fat. The warrior's frame expanded into the body of a man whose only exercise was riding, and whose riding was infrequent and unhurried. Ned, Robert waved him in. The wave was casual, the gesture of a man who did not expect the morning to be different from any other morning, whose expectations had been calibrated by 15 years of repetition, and who could not have anticipated the calibration's destruction. Sit, eat, the bacon's decent. Ned did not sit. Ned did not eat. The not sitting and the not eating were the first signals, the indicators that this audience was different, that the hand was not here for the daily report on sewage contracts and border disputes and the mundane machinery of governance. Robert, I need to speak with you about a matter that cannot leave this room. Robert looked up from his bacon. The king's eyes, still sharp, still capable of the assessment that had made him a formidable commander, registered the tone. The tone was Ned's serious tone, which was distinguishable from Ned's regular tone only by the men who knew him well enough to detect the distinction. Robert was one of those men. Close the door. Ned closed the door. He placed the book on the table, the lineages and histories, and he placed beside it the letters he had assembled, the notes from his visits to Robert's bastards. The summary of Jon Arryn's investigation, as Ned had reconstructed it, the physical evidence that the case required. Jon Arryn was not investigating finances when he died. He was investigating the parentage of your children. Robert's hand stopped halfway to the wine cup. The stop was not dramatic. It was the mechanical pause of a body receiving information that the brain had not yet processed, the momentary suspension of routine that preceded the collapse of routine. What? The book in front of you records every marriage between House Baratheon and House Lannister for the last 100 years. Every child produced by those marriages was black-haired. Every single one. The Baratheon coloring dominates. It always dominates. It dominated in your own father's generation and in his father's before him. Ned. What are you? Joffrey is blonde. Myrcella is blonde. Tommen is blonde. 3 children, all golden-haired, all green-eyed, all showing no trace of the Baratheon features that have appeared in every Baratheon child for 100 years. Ned's voice was level, the northern voice, unornamented, delivering devastation with the tonal flatness of a man describing weather. I visited your bastard children in the city. Gendry, the boy at the blacksmith's shop. Barra, the infant girl, both dark-haired, both unmistakably yours. Your seed is strong, Robert. It has always been strong. The 3 children in the nursery are not yours. The silence that followed was not silence. It was the suspended moment between the detonation and the blast, the fraction of time during which the explosion had occurred, but the shockwave had not yet arrived. Robert's face was undergoing a transformation that Ned had witnessed only once before. During the rebellion, when news came that Lyanna had been taken by Rhaegar, the same progression, comprehension, disbelief, and then the thing that lived beneath both, the force that Robert's character was built on, and that his kingship had been insufficient to contain. Rage, that's, you're telling me, who? Jaime Lannister. The wine cup left the table at a velocity that no one would have predicted from the arm that threw it. The cup hit the wall and exploded, arbor gold spraying across the stone, the ceramic shattering into fragments that scattered across the floor and that no one would clean for hours, because no servant would enter this room for hours. The Kingslayer, Robert, was standing. The standing was the eruption, the physical expression of a fury that the chair could not contain, and that the room could barely hold. Robert's fists were clenched. The knuckles were white. The body that had once been the most dangerous weapon in Westeros was shaking with the force of an anger that exceeded the body's capacity to express it. She, in my bed, with him, for 15 years, Robert. I will kill her. I will kill her, and I will kill him, and I will kill every golden-haired bastard that crawled out of there. Robert grabbed the edge of the table and threw it. The table, heavy oak, laden with plates and correspondence, went sideways and crashed into the wall, and the crash was the punctuation that Robert's words required, and that his body demanded. Robert, stop. Do not tell M.E. to stop. Robert turned on Ned with the violence of a man whose fury had found no adequate target and whose friend was the nearest available surface. 15 years. She sat beside me on that throne, and she laughed at me. Every day, every feast, every court appearance. She looked at me with those green eyes, and she knew that every child I held, every boy I called my son, every girl I... Robert's voice broke. The break was not tears. The break was the structural failure of a man whose identity had been rewritten in 60 seconds, and whose structure could not support the new architecture. Sit down. Ned's voice was iron. The iron was the North, the authority of a lord who commanded obedience through presence rather than volume, the weight that Ned brought to conversations that other men would have navigated with diplomacy. Sit down and listen to me. Robert sat. The sitting was not obedience. It was the collapse of a man whose legs had run out of the energy that his arms had consumed in throwing furniture. The king sat on the floor. The king of the 7 kingdoms sat on the floor of his own solar with wine dripping down the wall behind him and the remains of his breakfast. Scattered around him, and the knowledge that his wife had been sleeping, with her brother pressing down on his skull with a weight that made standing impossible. I will kill her, Robert said. The voice was quiet now. The quiet was worse than the shouting, the controlled fury that replaced the volcanic eruption, the hot anger cooling into the cold anger that was more dangerous, because cold anger made plans and hot anger only made noise. I will kill her, and I will kill the Kingslayer, and I will kill every. You will not kill the children. They are not my children. They are children. Myrcella is 8 years old. Tommen is 7. Whatever Cersei did, the children did not choose their parentage. Their parentage is their crime. Their parentage is their misfortune. The crime belongs to Cersei and Jaime. If you kill the children, you become Tywin Lannister, the man who ordered the murder of Rhaegar's children during the sack. Is that the king you want to be? The comparison hit Robert with the force that Ned intended, the invocation of the act that Robert had pretended to deplore while privately accepting, the reminder that the murder of children was the line that separated kings from monsters, and that the line was the only thing that Robert's legacy could not afford to cross. "I want them gone," Robert said. "Out of the keep, out of the city, out of my sight. I do not care where they go, but they will not stay here. They will not sit at my table. They will not call me father. That can be arranged. But it must be done through law, not through murder. You are the king. The king's power is the law. If you act outside the law, you give Tywin Lannister the justification he needs to march on this city. Let him march. I broke Rhaegar on the Trident. I'll break the old lion the same way. You broke Rhaegar with an army and a cause. If you murder Cersei without trial, your cause is butchery, and your army will question whether the butcher is worth following. If you try her, present the evidence, render the verdict through the mechanisms of justice, the cause is the law, and the army follows the law. Robert stared at Ned. The stare was the assessment of a man whose rage was being channeled by his friend's logic, and whose assessment was the determination of whether the channel was strong enough to hold the flood. A trial. A trial. The evidence is overwhelming. The verdict is inevitable, and the sentence is yours to determine, as the king, after the verdict is rendered. The sentence is death. The sentence is the king's decision. But the trial comes first. Robert was silent. The silence was the effort of a man containing himself, the physical labor of holding the rage inside a body that wanted to release it, the discipline that the rebellion had taught him, and that the kingship had atrophied, and that this moment was demanding. "Get her," Robert said. "Get her. And bring her to me." "Now, Robert. We should wait. Now, Ned. I want to see her face. I want to see the face she makes when she knows that I know. You can have your trial and your law and your evidence, but I will see her face first. Bring her." Now, Ned went to bring the Queen. The Queen in chains, Cersei Lannister, walked into the throne room expecting a routine summons. The summons had come from the king, unusual in itself, because Robert's communications with Cersei were limited to formal occasions and the reluctant interactions that marriage required and that both parties minimized. The throne room was the setting, unusual again, because Robert preferred his solar for private matters, and the throne room was reserved for audiences and ceremonies. But the summons was from the king, and the Queen did not refuse the king's summons, and the routine was the assumption that Cersei brought with her through the doors of the Great Hall. The assumption died the moment she crossed the threshold. Robert was on the Iron Throne. The throne, a massive, ugly construction of melted swords, the seat that cut every king who sat it, was occupied by a king whose posture was not the usual slouch of boredom, but the rigid attention of a man who was holding himself together through physical effort. Ned stood beside the throne. The Kingsguard lined the walls: Barristan Selmy, Aerys Oakhart, Meryn Trant, Preston Greenfield, Mandon Moore. Jaime was conspicuously absent. "Where is Sir Jaime?" Cersei asked. The question was the instinct of a woman whose twin was her anchor, and whose anchor's absence was the first signal of danger. "Sir Jaime is confined to his quarters," Robert said. "He will remain there until I decide otherwise." Cersei's eyes moved from Robert to Ned. The movement was the calculation of a woman who had survived 15 years in King's Landing by reading faces and motives, and whose reading of these two faces produced a single, devastating conclusion. They knew. The knowledge arrived in Cersei's body before it arrived in her conscious mind, the physical reaction preceding the intellectual, the heartbeat accelerating, and the hands tightening, and the spine stiffening in the instinctive preparation for combat that the body performed when the mind had not yet caught up. "Leave us," Cersei said to the Kingsguard. The command was the Queen's reflex, the attempt to control the room, to reduce the audience, to convert a public confrontation into a private one where her tools of manipulation could operate. "They stay," Robert said. "Everyone stays. This is not a conversation, Cersei. This is a reckoning." A reckoning. Cersei's voice was steady, The steadiness was the mask, the Lannister armor that Cersei wore the way Jaime wore plate, the composure that had been forged in Tywin Lannister's household and that operated in every crisis regardless of the crisis's severity. And what am I being reckoned for? Robert descended from the throne. The descent was deliberate, the king leaving the elevated position to stand on the same level as the queen, the equalization of height that was also the elimination of distance and that brought Robert's face within 2 feet of Cersei's. Are they mine? 3 words, the 3 words that contained the entirety of the accusation and that required no elaboration because the accusation's meaning was self-evident to anyone who heard it and devastating to the woman it was aimed at. Cersei could have denied it. The denial was available, the reflexive response, the instinctive defense, the lie that had sustained the deception for 15 years and that might have sustained it for 15 more if the liar's nerve held. Cersei was capable of the lie. Cersei had lived the lie. The lie was the floor she had stood on for her entire marriage, and the floor was collapsing. And the instinct was to deny the collapse. She did not deny it. The decision not to deny was Cersei's character asserting itself, the pride that was simultaneously her greatest strength and her catastrophic weakness. The Lannister refusal to cower before anyone, even a king, even a husband, even the man whose crown she had systematically undermined for a decade and a half. Denial was the weapon of the weak. Cersei was not weak. Cersei was a lion, and lions did not grovel. They were never yours. The words landed on the throne room like a blade on stone. Robert's face went through the transformation that Ned had witnessed in the Solar. The sequence of comprehension and fury, and the thing beneath both, but this time, the transformation produced not furniture throwing, but the focused immobility of a man whose rage had exceeded his body's capacity to express it, and whose body had simply stopped. She admits it. Robert's voice was directed at Ned, but his eyes were on Cersei. She stands in my throne room and admits it to my face. I admit nothing. I declare. My children are Jaime's. They are lions, not stags. They have the blood of the rock in their veins, the blood of Casterly Rock and 300 years of Lannister greatness. And they are worth more than every bastard you scattered across this city while you drank yourself into irrelevance. Robert's hand moved. The movement was not deliberate. It was the reflexive response of a man whose wife had just declared that his children were his brother-in-law's and whose body answered the declaration before his mind could intervene. The hand struck Cersei across the face. The sound was sharp. The blow was hard. Cersei staggered, but did not fall, the lion's balance. The Lannister equilibrium that physical violence could not dislodge even when the violence was delivered by a king's hand. Ned's hand was on the king's arm. The grip was firm, the physical restraint that the northern lord applied to the southern king. The friend's intervention in the husband's violence. Enough. Enough. She just told me. She told you the truth. The truth is what you needed to hear. Striking her does not change the truth. It changes the audience's perception of the man who struck her. Robert looked at the Kingsguard, 5 white knights standing against the walls, their faces showing the professional blankness that the Kingsguard maintained during moments that required professional blankness. The discipline of men whose duty was to protect the royal family and whose family was currently destroying itself. Arrest her, Robert said. Take her to the black cells. Not the black cells, Ned said. The tower chambers. Under guard, with her rights preserved for trial. Trial. Robert's voice made the words sound like profanity. She just confessed. In front of witnesses. What trial? The trial that the law requires and that the realm will demand. A queen accused of treason is entitled to a trial before the lords of the realm. The confession simplifies the trial. It does not eliminate it. Robert's jaw was working. The grinding of teeth that accompanied the containment of fury. The physical labor of a man restraining himself from the violence that his character demanded and that his friend was preventing. Fine, the tower, under guard. And bring me the Kingslayer. Jaime Lannister was brought to the throne room in chains. The chains were not strictly necessary. Jaime had been confined to his quarters, not the dungeon, and the confinement had been voluntary in the sense that Jaime had not resisted when the guards arrived. But the chains were the statement that Robert wanted delivered. The Kingslayer, the Golden Knight, the most famous swordsman in Westeros, brought before the king in irons like a common prisoner. Jaime entered the throne room with the walk that Jaime brought to every room, the controlled stride, the balanced posture, the physical confidence that chains could diminish but not eliminate. The chains clinked against the stone floor. The sound was the only sound in the hall, because the hall was holding its breath, and the breath was waiting for the explosion. "Your sister has confessed," Robert said. 3 children, 15 years, in my bed, in my castle, under my roof. Jaime said nothing. The silence was not submission. It was the assessment of a man whose tactical instincts were evaluating the room and whose evaluation was producing no favorable options. Robert was on the throne. 5 Kingsguard lined the walls. Ned Stark stood beside the king. Jaime was in chains. The mathematics of the situation was simple, and the conclusion was inescapable. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Robert leaned forward. "Did you think you could cuckold the king of the 7 kingdoms for 15 years and walk free? I thought it would last as long as it lasted." The answer was Jaime at his most dangerous, the honest reply. Delivered without apology and without defiance, the statement of a man whose conscience had been simplified by decades of moral compromise, and whose simplification produced a directness that other men's complexity did not permit. "You swore an oath. The Kingsguard oath. To protect my family. To protect my honor. And you used the oath as a cover to bed my wife and father bastards and seat your bastard son on the Iron Throne. I swore the oath at 17. I was a boy. The oath was a cage, not a calling. The cage kept you in the same castle as my wife. How convenient." Barristan Selmy stepped forward. The old knight's intervention was the intervention of the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the man whose institution had been desecrated by his subordinates' actions, and whose response was the measured authority that 60 years of service had produced. "Sir Jaime, you will have the opportunity to speak at your trial. This is not your trial. Be silent." Jaime was silent. The silence was the compliance of a man whose options had narrowed to one, survived long enough for the next move to present itself. The next move was not yet visible. The chains were tight. The throne room was full of enemies. And the woman whose presence had justified every compromise Jaime had ever made was in a tower, under guard, waiting for the trial that Ned Stark's insistence had provided, and that Robert Baratheon's rage had nearly prevented. "Take him back," Robert said. "The black cells, not the tower. The cells. The Queen gets comfort. The Kingslayer gets stone." Jaime was taken. The Kingsguard escorted their former brother through the corridors of the Red Keep, past the courts and chambers and hallways that Jaime had walked for 15 years as a White Knight, and that he was now walking as a prisoner, the geography unchanged, and the man's position within it inverted. Robert sat on the Iron Throne. The king's weight settled into the jagged seat, and the seat cut him, a blade against the forearm, the blood welling up in the thin line that the throne produced and that every king endured. And Robert did not notice the cut, because the cut was trivial against the wound that the morning had delivered. "What have I done, Ned?" The voice was the voice of the broken man beneath the furious king, the private Robert, the man whose friendship with Ned was the only relationship in his life that had not been corrupted by power or poisoned by betrayal. 15 years. How did I not see it? You saw what you wanted to see. You saw the children, and you saw the crown, and you saw the life that the rebellion was supposed to produce. You did not look behind the seeing, because looking behind the seeing would have meant seeing the truth, and the truth was too expensive. The truth is always expensive. You told me that once. I did. You were right. The golden children, the question of the children, was the question that kept Ned awake. 3 children. Joffrey, 13, golden-haired, cruel in the way that boys without consequence were cruel. The eldest and the most dangerous, because the eldest had been raised as the crown prince, and the raising had produced a boy who believed the world owed him deference. and whose beliefs' foundation had just been demolished. Myrcella, 8, golden-haired, gentle in the way that protected girls were gentle, innocent of her mother's crimes, and guilty only of existing as the evidence of those crimes. Tommen, 7, golden-haired, soft and kind and frightened of everything, and deserving of the protection that his parentage was about to remove. Robert wanted them dead. The desire was not articulated as desire. Robert did not say, "I want them dead," with the directness that the desire demanded. The desire was expressed through the language of governance and precedent. The children were bastards born of incest. The children were pretenders to the throne. The children's existence was a continuing challenge to the legitimacy of the Baratheon dynasty. The children could not be permitted to survive as rallying points for Lannister ambition. The language was legal. The intent was murder. Ned was standing in the king's solar on the morning after the arrests, the morning after the throne room confrontation, the morning after a night in which Robert had not slept, and Ned had not slept, and the Red Keep had vibrated with the tension of a household whose power structure had been overturned in the space of a single conversation. The children are innocent. The children are Lannisters. The children are children. Tommen is 7 years old. He is afraid of cats. He likes to draw pictures of ships. He did not choose his mother or his father, and he does not understand why his mother was taken from him, and he is sitting in his chambers right now, crying for a woman who will not come back. Sentiment. Principle. You are the king. The king's justice is the standard by which the realm measures its own conduct. If the king murders children, the realm learns that children are legitimate targets. If the king protects children, even the children of his enemies, the realm learns that innocence matters, that the law distinguishes between the guilty and the blameless. You want me to raise them. You want me to feed and clothe and educate the bastards that my wife produced with her brother. I want you to send them away. Casterly Rock. The faith. Somewhere distant, somewhere they cannot be used against you, somewhere the Lannisters can take responsibility for the children the Lannisters produced. Remove them from King's Landing. Remove them from the succession. Remove them from your sight. But do not kill them. Robert was pacing. The pacing was the physical expression of a man whose body needed movement the way his mind needed resolution. The kinetic response to a problem that the king's rage wanted solved through violence, and that the Hand's Council was directing toward diplomacy. Joffrey, Robert said. The name carried the accumulated bitterness of 13 years of observing a boy he had believed was his son, and recognizing, in retrospect, in the merciless clarity of the truth, the cruelty, the cowardice, the petulance that Robert had attributed to Cersei's influence, and that were, in fact, the characteristics of a boy whose father was the Kingslayer, and whose mother was the Kingslayer's twin, and whose genetic inheritance was the concentrated product of a union that should never have occurred. Joffrey is not a child. Joffrey is a weapon that Cersei built and aimed at the throne. Joffrey is 13. He is old enough to be dangerous and young enough to change. Send him to Casterly Rock, or to the Faith. Give him the chance that his mother's ambition denied him, the chance to become someone other than the instrument of her plans. And if he doesn't change? If he sits at Casterly Rock and nurses his grievance and comes back in 10 years with an army, then you deal with him in 10 years. But dealing with a 13-year-old boy through execution is not justice. It is fear dressed as governance. Robert stopped pacing. The stopping was the decision, the moment when the king's rage encountered the Hand's logic, and the logic was sufficient to redirect the rage without extinguishing it. Send them to the rock. All three. Tyrion can manage them. The dwarf is the only Lannister I don't want to strangle. But they leave today. I want them out of this castle before the sun sets. I do not want to see them. I do not want to hear them. I want them gone. The children were removed. The removal was managed by Ned. Not the guards, not the servants, but the Hand himself, because Ned believed that the authority ordering the children's displacement should be present for the displacement, that the order and the responsibility were inseparable. Myrcella cried. The crying was the bewildered grief of a child whose world had ended without explanation. The girl had been told that her mother was unwell, and that she was going to visit her grandfather at Casterly Rock, and that the visit would be exciting. And the lies were the kindest lies available, and the kindest lies were still lies, and the girl was old enough to sense the falseness, and young enough to be wounded by it. Tommen cried harder. The boy's tears were the overwhelming tears of a child who did not understand, and who could not understand, and whose lack of understanding was the mercy that incomprehension sometimes provided to those too young for comprehension. Joffrey did not cry. Joffrey screamed. The screaming was rage, the same rage that Robert had expressed through furniture and that Joffrey expressed through words, the genetic inheritance of temperament that passed through mothers as easily as through fathers. "You are not my father," Joffrey shrieked at the walls of the carriage that was taking him from the Red Keep. "You were never my father. My mother will come for me. My grandfather will come for me, and when they come, you will burn." The carriage rolled south through the city gates and turned west on the Gold Road and carried the 3 golden children toward the Westerlands and the rock and the uncertain future that the truth had produced, and that the children's innocence could not prevent. Ned watched the carriage until it disappeared. The watching was the vigil, the Northern Lord's silent acknowledgement of the cost, the recognition that the truth he had told Robert had not ended the crisis, but had merely transformed it from a crisis of deception into a crisis of consequence. The children were gone. The Queen was in the tower. The Kingslayer was in the cells. And the consequences were arriving with the speed and weight that consequences always brought when the truth was spoken in the wrong place and at the right time. The unwanted heir, the Raven, reached Dragonstone in 3 days. The message was from the hand of the king, written in Ned Stark's economical hand. And the message was an invitation that was also an obligation. "Your Grace is requested at King's Landing to discuss matters of succession. The crown requires your counsel." Stannis Baratheon read the message and ground his teeth and packed his ships and sailed for King's Landing. Because Stannis Baratheon was a man who responded to duty the way iron responded to the forge. Without enthusiasm, but with the unflinching certainty that the response was required. Stannis arrived at the Red Keep on a morning when the court was empty, the lords and ladies of King's Landing having scattered with the instinctive flight reflex that courtiers displayed when the power structure collapsed and the new structure had not yet solidified. The court was a ghost of its former population. The hallways were quiet. The whispers had replaced the conversation, and the whispers were all about the same thing: the Queen, the Kingslayer, the children, the throne. Brother, Robert greeted Stannis in the small council chamber. The greeting was the flattest word Robert had ever spoken, the single syllable containing 15 years of sibling rivalry, of resentment, of the mutual contempt that Robert and Stannis had cultivated the way other brothers cultivated affection. Robert did not like Stannis. Stannis did not like Robert. The dislike was the foundation of their relationship, and the foundation was being asked to support a structure it was never designed to hold. "I knew," Stannis said. The statement preceded any greeting, any ceremony, any acknowledgement of the context that had produced the summons. Stannis walked into the council chamber and delivered the information the way Stannis delivered everything, directly, without preamble, and with the implicit accusation that the recipient should have known sooner. "You knew. Jon Arryn and I investigated together. The bastards, the book, the pattern. Jon Arryn and I discovered the truth a year before he died. He was going to tell you. He was murdered before he could." Robert's face underwent the now familiar transformation, the compression of features that preceded the explosion of temper. "You knew. You knew my children were bastards and my wife was bedding her brother, and you didn't tell me?" "I told Jon Arryn. Jon Arryn was the hand. The hand advises the king. The proper channel was through the hand, and the proper channel was followed." "The proper channel? My wife was committing treason under my roof and you sent the information through the proper channel? You would not have believed me." Stannis' voice carried the weight of conviction. The absolute certainty that characterized every statement Stannis made, and that made his statements simultaneously reliable and infuriating. You have never believed me. You see me as the brother you tolerate, the brother whose company is an obligation rather than a pleasure. If I had come to you and said your wife was an adulteress, you would have dismissed it as jealousy or malice or the complaint of a younger brother who coveted what the elder possessed. That's not. It is. You know it is. I know you know it is. Jon Arryn would have been believed because Jon Arryn was trusted. I would have been doubted because I am Stannis. The distinction is not fair. The distinction is accurate. Robert opened his mouth. Robert closed his mouth. The closing was the concession, the admission, delivered through silence rather than words, that Stannis was right, and that the rightness was intolerable, and that the intolerability did not make it less right. Ned watched the exchange from the side of the table. The watching was the observation of a man who understood both brothers, Robert's expansive, violent character and Stannis' compressed, rigid one, and who was witnessing the collision of two temperaments that the crisis was forcing into cooperation. The succession, Ned said. The two words redirected the conversation from the brothers' grievance to the kingdom's crisis, with Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen removed from the line. The Iron Throne passes to Stannis as Robert's eldest surviving brother. I know the law, Robert said. The statement was the grudging acknowledgement of a man confronting a legal reality he despised. Stannis is my heir. Until I produce a legitimate son, Stannis is the heir to the Iron Throne. Your Grace flatters me with his enthusiasm. Don't push it. Stannis' appointment as heir was formalized in a royal decree, the document that rewrote the succession, that stripped the three golden children of their titles and their claims and their place in the line, that replaced the golden generation with the Iron Brother. The decree was sent to every Lord Paramount in the Seven Kingdoms. The decree was the first official act of the truth's aftermath, and the act's finality was the signal that the Baratheon dynasty had undergone a restructuring that was political and personal and permanent. Stannis was named heir and Prince of Dragonstone. The title was not the Iron Throne. It was the waiting room for the Iron Throne, the holding position that heirs occupied while the current king lived, and that the heir would vacate when the king died. Stannis accepted the title with the grace that an iron bar accepted a bend, visibly, reluctantly, and with a clear impression that the acceptance was being endured rather than embraced. I will serve, Stannis said, as the law requires and as duty demands. Try to enjoy it. I do not enjoy. I perform. 15 years and that's still the most depressing thing you've ever said. Renly arrived 2 days after Stannis, Robert's youngest brother, charming, handsome, the Baratheon who had inherited Robert's charisma without inheriting Robert's self-destructive tendencies, rode into King's Landing with the relaxed authority of a man whose position in the family had always been defined by its distance from responsibility. Renly was Lord of Storm's End, Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, and, until this week, third in line to the throne behind 3 children who turned out to be someone else's. I heard the news, Renly said. His tone was light, the conversational ease that was Renly's default, and that some mistook for frivolity, and that was, in fact, the surface expression of a political intelligence that operated best when it appeared to operate not at all. So Cersei was bedding Jaime. I confess, I'm not entirely surprised. Have you seen the way they look at each other? Not helpful, Renly, Robert said. When has being helpful ever been my role? I'm the charming one. Stannis is the dutiful one. You're the angry one. We each play our part. This is not a performance. Everything in King's Landing is a performance. Brother, the difference is that some of us know our lines. Renly's levity masked a calculation that was not levity at all. With Stannis named heir, Renly's own position had shifted. No longer third in line behind false children, but second in line behind a brother whose personality made kingship unlikely to produce popular support. Renly was evaluating. Renly was positioning. And Renly's positioning was the early indication of the ambitions that Stannis' humorless competence could not suppress, and that Robert's declining health would eventually encourage. The Baratheon brothers, 3 men whose shared blood was the only thing they shared, stood in the small council chamber and looked at the map of the 7 kingdoms and contemplated the kingdom that their family had seized through war and nearly lost through incest. and that the truth's revelation had preserved through the narrowest of margins. Tywin will come, Stannis said. The statement was delivered with the certainty that Stannis brought to all strategic assessments. His daughter is in chains. His grandchildren are exiled. His son is in the black cells. Tywin Lannister will not accept this. Let him come, Robert said. The response was the same response Robert gave to every military threat. The reflexive aggression of a man whose talents were martial and whose problems all looked like enemies waiting to be defeated. He will come with 40,000 men. The Westerlands can field 40,000 swords within a fortnight, and I can field 100,000. The Stormlands, the Crownlands, the Reach, Mace Tyrell has been falling over himself to demonstrate loyalty since the news broke. The North will send men if I ask. The North will send men, Ned confirmed. Robb can lead them south. Stannis nodded. The nod was the tactical agreement, the acknowledgement that the numbers favored the crown and that Tywin's challenge, while inevitable, was a challenge that could be met and defeated. Then, we prepare. We assemble the army. We secure the Gold Road, and when Tywin marches, we meet him with a force he cannot overcome. I'm going to lead it, Robert said. The statement was not a suggestion. The statement was the declaration of a man whose body had been idle for 15 years, and whose idleness was about to end, and whose ending was the only thing about this crisis that Robert was looking forward to. You're the king. Kings don't lead armies. This king does. This king broke Rhaegar on the Trident, and this king will break Tywin at the Golden Tooth, and when it's done, the Lannister question will be settled, and the realm will know that the stag still has horns. The Queen's trial Cersei was tried before the Lords of the Realm. The trial was held in the Great Hall of the Red Keep. The throne room cleared of its usual furnishings and filled instead with the benches and tables and the formal architecture of judgment. The panel of lords, 7, chosen by Ned from the major houses to represent the breadth of the kingdom, sat in judgment of the Queen, whose confession had made the trial a formality and whose defiance had made the formality a spectacle. The evidence was presented. Ned presented it methodically, the book of lineages, the testimony of witnesses who had observed Cersei and Jaime's interactions, the physical appearance of the children compared to Robert's bastards, the confessions that servants had provided under interrogation. Grand Maester Pycelle confirmed that Jon Arryn had been investigating the same evidence before his death. Varys confirmed, with the reluctance of a man whose profession required discretion and whose discretion was being overridden by circumstances, that the relationship between Cersei and Jaime had been known in certain circles for years. Cersei stood before the panel in a gown of crimson and gold, the Lannister colours, the choice deliberate, the statement that even in chains the Queen identified with the lion rather than the crown. Her posture was the Lannister posture, straight-backed, chin elevated, the physical expression of a woman who regarded the proceedings as an indignity rather than a reckoning. I have nothing to say to this court, Cersei said when asked for her defense. I spoke the truth to the king, and I will not apologize for the truth. My children are Jaime's. They have Lannister blood. They are worth more than the verdict of 7 lords, whose combined intelligence would not sustain a conversation with my father. The Queen's contempt for the court is noted, Stannis said. He was presiding as the king's representative. Robert had been forbidden by Ned from attending, because Robert's presence would have transformed the trial from a legal proceeding into a confrontation, and the confrontation's outcome was predictable and bloody. The Queen may reconsider her position. The court is here to render justice, not to receive insults. Justice. Your family stole the throne from the Targaryens, and you call the theft justice. My family paid the debts that kept your family's stolen kingdom from collapsing, and you call the payment service. And now you presume to judge me for the one honest thing I did, loving a man who was worth loving instead of enduring a man who was not. The statement was Cersei at her most devastating, the intelligence deployed without restraint, the words chosen for maximum damage, the Queen whose political acuity had been constrained by her gender now unleashing it in a context where constraint no longer mattered, because the outcome was already determined. The verdict was guilty. The 7 lords voted unanimously, guilty of treason, guilty of adultery. guilty of passing false heirs to the throne. The vote was not close. The evidence was not ambiguous. The confession had rendered the deliberation unnecessary, and the deliberation was conducted for the sake of the process, rather than the sake of the truth. The sentence was Robert's to pronounce. Robert descended from the upper gallery, where he had watched the trial despite Ned's prohibition, the king who could not stay away from the reckoning that the kingdom was conducting on his behalf. Robert stood before Cersei, and looked at the woman he had married and bedded and ignored and tolerated for 15 years, and who had, throughout those 15 years, been conducting a separate life with a separate man and producing separate children that she passed off as his. "Death," Robert said. "Robert," Ned began. "Death. The sentence for treason is death. The Queen committed treason. The Queen dies." "Robert, consider the consequences. Tywin can come watch. The sentence is death." Cerillin Payne stepped forward. The king's justice, mute, expressionless, the executioner, whose profession was the administration of endings that the law demanded, stood before the Queen with the greatsword that the position required, and the patience that the profession demanded. Ned, Cersei's voice, for the first time since the confrontation in the throne room, carried a note that was not defiance, but something beneath defiance. The recognition, arriving late and arriving fully, that the process she had treated with contempt was about to produce a conclusion she had not truly believed would arrive. "Ned, you promised. You told me once that you were not the sort of man who—" "I did not tell you anything," Ned said. The correction was precise. Ned had not warned Cersei, had not given her the chance that Canon Ned would have given, had not provided the opportunity for escape that mercy would have demanded. The correction was also the wound, the recognition that the choice not to warn Cersei had produced this outcome, and that the outcome was the consequence of the choice, and that the consequence was not what Ned had intended when the choice was made. "Robert, exile is sufficient. The Silent Sisters, the equivalent of death without the blood. The realm will see that the king enforces the law. The law says death. I am the law." The sentence stands. Cersei died in the courtyard of the Red Keep on a morning when the sun was bright and the wind was still, and the assembled court watched with the mute attention that public executions demanded, and that the public's complicity in the execution required. The execution was clean. Cerillin's blade was sharp. The stroke was practiced. And the death was the instantaneous transition from living woman to historical fact. Robert watched. The king's face showed nothing during the execution. The containment that the public moment demanded, and that the private man behind the containment would pay for in the nights that followed. When the containment dissolved and the drinking accelerated, and the image of the blade falling replayed in the darkness behind his closed eyes. Ned watched. The hand's face showed the cost, the recognition that the truth he had told Robert had produced this death, that the chain of consequences from discovery to execution was unbroken, and that every link in the chain had been forged by decisions that Ned had made or failed to prevent. The truth had been spoken. The truth had been acted upon. And the truth's price was a woman's head on the stones of the Red Keep, watched by a court that was horrified, and a king who was satisfied, and a hand who was wondering, for the first time since the discovery, whether the truth had been worth telling. The Kingslayer's sentence Jaime was tried separately. The trial was shorter than Cersei's. The evidence was the same. The confession was implied by the Queen's confession, and Jaime's defense was the absence of defense that Jaime brought to the proceedings with the fatalism of a man whose sister was dead, and whose children were exiled, and whose life's purpose had been removed. Guilty, the Lords pronounced. The sentence was the question. Robert wanted death, the completion of the destruction, the elimination of both halves of the incestuous pair that had humiliated him. Ned wanted the wall, the mercy that preserved a life while extracting its freedom, the compromise between justice and destruction. The wall or the block, Ned told Robert in the private chamber where the sentence was being decided. Those are the options. Death is justice. The wall is mercy that serves a purpose. The watch needs men. And Jaime Lannister with a sword at the wall is more valuable than Jaime Lannister without a head in the ground. He fucked my wife. Yes, and killing him for it accomplishes what? Cersei is dead. The children are gone. The Lannister threat is being addressed. Killing Jaime gives you satisfaction. Sending him to the wall gives the kingdom a sword. Choose the kingdom. Robert chose the kingdom. The choice was not magnanimity. It was the recognition that Ned's argument was sound, and that the soundness mattered more than the satisfaction, and that the satisfaction would be temporary, while the resentment of the Westerlands would be permanent. Jaime was sentenced to the wall. The sentence was delivered in the Great Hall, before the court, with the formality that the law demanded. You will go to the wall, Robert told Jaime. You will take the black. You will serve the Night's Watch for the remainder of your life. Your name will be removed from the Book of Brothers. Your position in the Kingsguard is forfeit. Your titles, your lands, your inheritance, all forfeit. You go north as a man with nothing, and you serve as a man with nothing, and the nothing is the only mercy I have the stomach to provide. Jaime looked at Robert. The look was the last communication between two men whose relationship had been defined by a throne room and a dead king, the Kingslayer and the usurper. The man who killed one king, and the man who replaced him, linked across the years by the act that had made them both, and that the intervening decades had complicated beyond recognition. I saved this city once, Jaime said. I killed the Mad King to save the people he wanted to burn. The realm called me Kingslayer for it. Now the realm calls me Oathbreaker, and sends me to freeze. The consistency is admirable. The consistency is justice. You saved the city from the Mad King. You betrayed the king who rewarded you for it. The saving and the betrayal are both real. The wall is the balance. Jaime went north. The journey was the reverse of the journey he had taken 17 years earlier, the young knight riding south from the Riverlands to join the Kingsguard. The Golden Boy entering the capital with the confidence that Golden Boys brought to every room. Now the Golden Boy was a man in chains, riding north through the King's Road toward the wall and the cold and the service that would consume the remainder of his life. Tyrion watched his brother leave from the gates of the Red Keep. The dwarf, the surviving Lannister, the brother who had not been involved in the incest and who was not being punished for it, and whose lack of involvement was the only Lannister achievement of the week, stood in the courtyard and watched the escort ride north, and felt the family's destruction settle on his shoulders with the weight that destruction always carried. They're all gone, Tyrion said to no one. His voice carried the flatness of a man whose emotional resources had been exhausted by the week's events, and whose exhaustion was producing a clarity that comfort would have obscured. Father will go to war. Cersei is dead. Jaime is heading for the wall. And I, the dwarf, the disappointment, the one Lannister that father wished had never been born, I am the last one standing. The irony was not lost on anyone. The irony was the only inheritance that the weak had left intact. The Lion Wakes the Raven from Casterly Rock arrived 2 weeks after Cersei's execution. The message was from Tywin Lannister, and the message was not a declaration of war. Tywin Lannister did not declare wars. Tywin Lannister conducted wars. The distinction was the difference between the man and the institution. The declaration was a legal formality that provided the enemy with warning. And Tywin did not provide warnings. The message was a demand. The demand was written in Tywin's hand, the precise, angular script that communicated authority through penmanship the way other men communicated it through volume. To Robert Baratheon, who styles himself King of the Seven Kingdoms, you have murdered my daughter. You have imprisoned my son. You have exiled my grandchildren. These acts were committed under the pretense of law. But the law that permits a king to murder his wife is the law of tyranny, not the law of justice. I require the following: the return of my grandchildren to Casterly Rock, the release of my son from the wall, the acknowledgement that the execution of my daughter was unlawful, and the payment of reparations to House Lannister in the amount of 3 million gold dragons. Failure to comply will be met with the response that the insult demands. Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, Shield of Lannisport, Warden of the West Robert, read the letter and laughed. The laugh was not humour. It was the release of tension that only Robert could achieve through contempt, the volcanic temperament expressing itself through derision rather than destruction. 3 million gold dragons. The old lion thinks I'm going to pay him for executing the woman who cuckolded me. Ned, this is the funniest thing that's happened since I sat this damned throne. Tywin is not making a demand he expects fulfilled. He is establishing a casus belli, a legal pretext for the war he has already decided to fight. The demands are impossible by design. The impossibility is the justification. I don't care about his justifications. I care about his army. Stannis, how many men can Tywin field? Stannis had been tracking the Westerland's military disposition with the methodical attention that Stannis brought to every strategic assessment. 40,000 swords from the Westerlands proper. An additional 5,000 sellswords if Tywin can recruit from Essos, which he will. 45,000, mobilized and marching within a month. And we have? The Crownlands provide 15,000. The Stormlands, under Renly's command, provide 20,000. The Reach, if the Tyrells commit fully, provides 50,000. The North, if Lord Stark calls the banners, provides 20,000. The Riverlands, under Edmure Tully, add another 10,000, though the Riverlands' position between the Westerlands and the capital makes their forces vulnerable to Tywin's advance. 115,000 against 45,000. In theory. In practice, the forces are dispersed across the continent and require weeks to assemble. Tywin's forces are concentrated in the Westerlands and can march as a unified army. The advantage of numbers is offset by the disadvantage of coordination. Then, we coordinate faster. Robert's voice had changed. The change was visible. The king who had spent 15 years drowning in wine and boredom was surfacing. The warrior rising through the sediment of idleness. The man who had crushed Rhaegar on the trident, emerging from the man who had sat the Iron Throne and rotted. Send ravens. Every lord who owes fealty to the Iron Throne assembles their forces. The Tyrells march north from Highgarden. Robb Stark marches south from Winterfell. Renly brings the Stormlands. We concentrate at Harrenhal and move west. The Gold Road is the direct route, Stannis observed. But Tywin will expect the Gold Road. The mountain passes at the Golden Tooth favor the defender. Then we go through the Riverlands and up the River Road. Or we split. One force on the Gold Road to pin Tywin's attention, a second through the Riverlands to flank. The details can be worked out. The point is, we move. We move before Tywin can establish his defenses. We move before the old lion can turn Casterly Rock into a fortress that takes a year to crack. Ned listened. The listening was the assessment of a man who had fought beside Robert in one war and who was watching Robert prepare for another, and who was seeing, in the preparation, the resurrection of a man whose burial had been premature. Robert was alive. The rage that the truth had produced was transforming, the personal fury becoming the military energy that Robert's character had always required, and that the peacetime kingship had never provided. The war was coming. The war was the consequence of the truth, the price that the truth extracted from the kingdom that received it. Ned had told Robert the truth to prevent the Lannister deception from continuing. The truth had produced an execution. The execution had produced a war. And the war was producing the strange, unsettling result of making Robert Baratheon feel alive for the first time in 15 years. The king rides west. Robert Baratheon put on his armor for the first time in 15 years. The armor did not fit. The breastplate, the famous war plate, the stag-helmed masterwork that Tobho Mott had forged for the Battle of the Trident, could not close around the torso that 15 years of feasting and drinking had produced. The gap was 3 inches. The 3 inches were the physical measurement of Robert's decline, the distance between the man who had crushed Rhaegar Targaryen and the man who had spent a decade and a half crushing wine cups instead. Stretch it, Robert told the armorer. Or make a new one. I don't care which. But I ride west in a week, and I ride in armor that fits. The armorer made a new breastplate. The new plate was wider, broader in the chest, broader in the gut, the accommodation of a body that had been magnificent and was now merely large. The antlered helm remained, the stag's crown that Robert had worn at the Trident, and that the 15 intervening years had not tarnished, because the helm had been stored rather than worn, and because storage preserved what use degraded. Robert rode from King's Landing at the head of 30,000 men, the Crownlands levies, the first contingent of Stormland's cavalry, and the vanguard of the royal army. The army moved west on the Gold Road with the ponderous deliberation of a military force that had not been assembled in a generation, and whose assembly was the logistical achievement of men whose profession was preparation for events that most of them never expected to occur. Ned rode beside Robert. The Hand had argued against the king's personal command. The argument was practical, not cowardly. The recognition that a king on the battlefield was a king at risk, and that the kingdom could not afford to lose Robert to a lucky arrow or an unlucky sword. Robert had overridden the argument with the counter-argument that only Robert could have made. I am not sending men to die in a war I started. I started this by marrying the woman, and I'll finish it by breaking the old man who sired her. The march was Robert's rebirth. The king on horseback, in armor, with an army at his back and an enemy ahead, the configuration that Robert's character had been designed for. The arrangement of circumstances that produced in Robert Baratheon the clarity and the purpose and the joy that 15 years of kingship had failed to generate. Robert was not a good king. Robert was a great warrior, and the difference between the two was the difference between competence and genius, and the genius was on display as the army moved west. Robert's commands were crisp. The logistics were delegated to men who understood logistics. Stannis, who remained in King's Landing as regent, communicated supply schedules by Raven, and the Blackfish, Brynden Tully, who had ridden south from Riverrun to join the campaign, managed the cavalry screens and the forward reconnaissance. But the strategy was Robert's, and the strategy was sound. Pin Tywin's eastern defences with the main army on the Gold Road, while a flanking force under the Blackfish moved through the Riverlands to approach the Westerlands from the north. The flanking force included 3,000 Stark soldiers, the first northern contingent, led by Griech on Umber, because Robb was still assembling the full northern levy at Winterfell, and the full levy would march south in the weeks to come. The Northmen were infantry, heavy foot soldiers whose endurance in rough terrain made them ideal for the mountain passes that the flanking route required. The Gretchen led them with the booming confidence that the Gretchen brought to everything. The giant Northman, whose volume was his primary tactical asset, and whose tactical asset was not negligible. The Tyrell army marched north from Highgarden, 50,000 men under Mace Tyrell's nominal command and Randall Tarley's practical leadership. The Tyrells were the decisive force, the largest single army in Westeros, the weight that tipped the scales from advantage to overwhelming superiority. The Tyrells marched not because the Tyrells loved Robert, but because the Tyrells recognized that the winning side was the profitable side, and that the profitable side was the side with 100,000 men, and a king who was actively fighting. Olenna Tyrell, as was her custom, provided the assessment that accompanied the commitment: we are marching for the stag because the lion is losing. When the lion is defeated, we will present the bill. The bill will include Margaery on a throne, one way or another. If Robert is too old for Margaery, a son of Robert's will suffice. The Tyrells do not invest without returns. The march reached Deepden in 3 weeks. Deepden was the border fortress of the Westerlands, the castle that guarded the eastern approaches to Tywin's territory, the first obstacle that any invading army faced when approaching from the Gold Road. Deepden was garrisoned by Lannister forces, 5,000 men under Sir Adam Marbrand, a competent commander whose competence was being tested by the arithmetic of facing 30,000. Robert did not besiege Deepden. Robert bypassed it. The decision was the tactical insight that separated Robert from the conventional commanders who would have invested weeks in reducing the fortress. Robert left a screening force of 5,000 men to contain Deepden's garrison, and marched the remaining 25,000 around the fortress through the hill country to the south, using trails that the Riverlord's scouts had identified and that the Lannister garrison had not defended because the trails were considered impassable for an army of this size. The trails were not impassable. The trails were difficult, and the difficulty cost 3 days and several hundred pack animals that fell on the mountain paths and whose cargoes had to be abandoned. But the army emerged on the western side of Deep Den, with its formation intact and its strength undiminished, and the Lannister garrison behind them suddenly irrelevant, a fortress guarding a road that the invaders had already passed. The Old Lion prepared for a siege, Robert told Ned as they rode through the western hills. Tywin wants me to spend months breaking down castle walls. I'm not going to break down walls. I'm going to walk past them and knock on his door. The Golden Tooth, the Battle of the Golden Tooth, was fought on the slopes of the mountain pass that gave the castle its name. The narrow defile through the western mountains, where the Gold Road threaded between granite walls, and where the Lannister forces had established the defensive position that Tywin had designed to stop precisely this kind of advance. Tywin was not at the Golden Tooth. Tywin was at Casterly Rock, 40 miles to the west, commanding the war through ravens and riders and the strategic vision that had made him the most feared military mind in Westeros. The Golden Tooth was commanded by Sir Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother, the reliable subordinate, the man whose competence was the steady flame to Tywin's blazing intelligence. Kevan had 15,000 men. The position was strong. The mountain pass funneled any attacking force into a narrow corridor where numbers were less important than discipline, and where the defender's advantage was multiplied by the terrain. Kevan had positioned his infantry across the pass in 3 lines, with cavalry in reserve behind the ridge, and the position was as close to impregnable as mountain warfare permitted. Robert attacked from 2 directions simultaneously. The main assault came through the pass itself, Robert at the head of the Crown Lands infantry, the king in his new breastplate with his warhammer in his fist, leading the advance through the defile with the personal courage that was Robert's greatest military asset, and the recklessness that was his greatest military liability. The assault was costly. The narrow pass compressed Robert's numerical advantage and exposed his soldiers to the crossbow fire and the rockfalls that Kevan's engineers had prepared. The first hour of the battle was a grinding advance, the attacking forces pushing forward yard by bloody yard against a defense that yielded ground reluctantly and made the yielding expensive. The second assault came from the north. The Blackfish's flanking force, the 3,000 Stark infantry under the Greatjon, supplemented by 2,000 Riverlanders, had spent 4 days climbing the mountain trails north of the Golden Tooth and descending on the reverse slope behind Kevan's position. The flanking force struck Kevan's reserve cavalry from above and behind. The downhill charge of northern infantry crashing into horsemen who were oriented toward the pass and whose reorientation came too late. The battle broke. Kevan's defense, caught between the hammer of Robert's frontal assault and the anvil of the Blackfish's flank attack, fractured along the seams that every defensive line contained and that the dual assault exposed. The Lannister infantry held for another hour, the discipline of professional soldiers whose training did not include surrender. And then the discipline failed, and the holding became retreating, and the retreating became running, and the running became the rout that every broken army produced when the defender's will collapsed and the attacker's momentum consumed the space that the will had vacated. Robert fought through the entire battle. The king's warhammer killed 7 men. The count was maintained by his squires, who tracked the kills with the accounting precision that squires brought to the documentation of their lord's martial achievements. The hammer's weight had not changed. Robert's arms had changed. Softer, slower, less precise than the arms that had killed Rhaegar, but the ferocity was unchanged, and the ferocity compensated for the decline, and the compensation produced a performance that the soldiers who witnessed it would describe for the rest of their lives. Kevan Lannister was captured during the rout. Tywin's brother, bloodied, exhausted, the competent subordinate whose competence had been insufficient against the combined force of Robert's aggression and the Blackfish's tactical brilliance, was brought before Robert in the pass with the remnants of his command staff and the dignity of a man whose defeat was complete and whose dignity was the only thing the defeat had not taken. Kevan Lannister, Robert said. The king was splattered with blood, his own and others, the mixture that battle produced and that Robert wore with the comfort of a man for whom blood was a familiar garment. Your brother sent you to hold the pass. The pass is mine. Do you have a message for the Old Lion? My brother does not accept messages. My brother issues them. Tell your brother that the next message I issue will be delivered in person, at the gates of Casterly Rock, with 100,000 men behind it. Tell him that the king he insulted is coming, and the king is not in a diplomatic mood. Kevan was held as a prisoner of war. The holding was strategic. Kevan was a hostage, whose value to Tywin was personal as well as military. And the hostage's value would increase as the campaign progressed. The Golden Tooth had fallen. The road to Casterly Rock was open, and Robert Baratheon, for the first time in 15 years, was the man he had been born to be. The warrior, the commander, the storm in human form that swept the field and left the enemy scattered, and the allies inspired, and the kingdom watching, with the mixture of admiration and apprehension that Robert's character had always produced. The Westerlands burn. The march from the Golden Tooth to Casterly Rock was the destruction of Tywin Lannister's legacy in reverse. Robert's army moved through the Westerlands with the disciplined devastation that 100,000 men produced when the 100,000 were commanded by a king whose rage had been refined into military purpose, and whose purpose was the systematic reduction of the enemy's capacity to resist. The Westerlands were rich. The gold mines, the silver mines, the productive farms, and the prosperous towns that Tywin's governance had built, and that the building had produced the wealth that Tywin used to fund the rebellion that the army was now suppressing. Robert did not burn indiscriminately. The decision was Ned's counsel, the hand's influence preventing the total war approach that Robert's temperament demanded, and that Robb Stark. Riding beside Ned with the northern contingent, supported, Ned argued, restraint, the Westerlands would need to function after the war, and a kingdom that destroyed the territory it conquered was a kingdom that inherited rubble. We burn the military targets, Ned told Robert during the march. Armories, supply depots, fortifications that could support a counterattack, the farms, the towns, the mines, those we preserve. The small folk of the Westerlands are not Tywin's soldiers. They are subjects who owe fealty to the throne, and the throne that destroys its subjects' livelihoods is a throne that produces rebels. You want me to conquer gently. I want you to conquer permanently. The gentle conquest is the permanent conquest. The brutal conquest produces a generation of men whose fathers were killed, and whose farms were burned, and whose grievance produces the rebellion's successor. Robert accepted the counsel with the grudging respect of a man whose instincts said otherwise, and whose instincts were being overruled by logic. The army moved through the Westerlands, destroying the military infrastructure and preserving the civilian. The castles of Lannister bannermen were invested and surrendered, while the farms and the small folk and the commercial life of the region were left intact. The distinction was imperfect. War's distinctions always were. The line between military and civilian blurred when the military billeted in civilian houses and the civilian fed the military, and the feeding was both hospitality and logistics. Soldiers looted despite orders against looting. Farmsteads were damaged despite instructions to preserve them. The Dornish contingent, Oberyn Martell's spearmen, whose ancestral grudge against the Lannisters predated the current war by 20 years, were the worst offenders. The contained fury of men whose families had been murdered by Lannister soldiers, and whose contained fury escaped containment when the opportunity presented itself. Control your men, Ned told Oberyn. My men are controlled. What you are seeing is the controlled version. The uncontrolled version would leave nothing standing between here and the coast. The uncontrolled version would produce a Westerlands that hates Dawn for a generation. The controlled version produces a Westerlands that resents Dawn for a decade. The difference is worth the effort. Oberyn's expression was the expression of a man for whom the Westerlands. Resentment was a matter of total indifference, and whose indifference was, being set aside because the king's hand required it, and because the king's hand's counsel had been sound throughout the campaign, and because the soundness had earned the deference that the council demanded. Robb Stark rode beside Ned through the campaign. The Stark heir, 20 years old, bearded, the image of Ned at 20 with Catelyn's auburn hair, was commanding the northern contingent with the competence that Ned's training had produced, and the enthusiasm that youth brought to warfare, and that Ned recognized as the enthusiasm's innocence would not survive. This is what war looks like. Ned told Robb as they rode through the countryside that the army had traversed. The countryside showed the marks, the trampled fields, the emptied granaries, the roads churned into mud by 60,000 pairs of boots and 10,000 horses. The marks were the signature that armies left on the land they passed through, and the signature was legible for years after the army's passage. It's not what the songs say. The songs are written by men who didn't march. The marching produces blisters and bowel complaints, and the knowledge that the enemy you're walking toward is a man whose face you'll see before you kill him, and whose face you'll remember after. The songs leave that part out. Father, you could have stayed at Winterfell. You didn't have to come. I told Robert the truth. The truth produced this war. The war is my responsibility as much as it is Robert's. A man who creates the conditions for war and stays home while others fight it is not a man whose counsel deserves to be followed. That's not what you told me about leadership. What I told you about leadership was that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. The extended version is, the man who tells the truth should ride the campaign that the truth produces. Robb considered this. The considering was the young lord's process, the absorption of a father's principle, the integration of the principle into the framework that the young lord was building for himself. Robb was not Ned. Robb was the next generation, the son who would take the father's principles and test them against the world that the father's generation had built, and that the testing would either validate or revise. The march produced intelligence as well as conquest. Every surrendered castle produced information. The garrison commanders, when offered mercy in exchange for cooperation, provided details about Tywin's defensive preparations at Casterly Rock. The information painted a picture. Tywin had concentrated his remaining forces at the rock, had stockpiled 6 months of provisions, had fortified the harbour approaches, and was preparing for a siege that he intended to outlast. He thinks he can wait us out, Robert said, reviewing the intelligence in the command tent. The old lion in his den, waiting for the storm to pass. Tywin's strategy is sound, the Blackfish observed. Brynden Tully was sitting across the map table with the contained assessment of a man whose military career had produced the appreciation for enemy competence that professional soldiers developed and that amateurs lacked. Casterly Rock has never been taken by storm. A conventional siege takes a year. Tywin is gambling that the coalition will fracture before the year is up. The Tyrells will go home to harvest, the Northmen will go home to winter, and the king will go home to govern. The king is not going home. The king's army might. 100,000 men eat a continent's worth of food. The supply lines from the Reach are stretched. The northern supplies are stretched further. Every week the siege continues, the logistics become more difficult, and the coalition's commitment becomes more contingent. Then, we don't siege. We find a way in. The Blackfish raised an eyebrow. The eyebrow was the assessment of a man whose experience included 40 years of siege warfare, and whose experience said that finding a way into Casterly Rock was the ambition of men who did not understand the engineering of Casterly Rock. The rock has no weak point. The walls are granite. The gates are reinforced. The harbour is blocked by a chain. There is no conventional point of entry that a small force could exploit. Then we find an unconventional one. The unconventional one was Tyrion. And Tyrion's tunnels were about to end a war. The rock, Casterly Rock, was a mountain. The description was not metaphorical. Casterly Rock was a literal mountain, a massive formation of golden stone that jutted from the coast of the Westerlands, honeycombed with tunnels and chambers and halls, the ancestral seat of House Lannister, and the most formidable fortress in the Seven Kingdoms. The rock had never been taken by storm. The rock had never been taken by siege. The rock had been taken once by Lann the Clever in the Age of Heroes, through trickery rather than force, and the method of the taking was a legend rather than a blueprint. Robert arrived at the rock with 60,000 men, his original force swelled by the Tyrell army that had marched north from Highgarden, and by the second northern contingent that Robb Stark had led south from Winterfell. The army surrounded the rock on 3 sides. The Redwyne fleet, contributed by the Tyrells, commanded by Paxter Redwyne, blockaded the harbour on the 4th. The siege was total. The isolation was complete. Tywin Lannister was inside. The Old Lion, with 20,000 men, the survivors of the Golden Tooth, the garrison forces, the household troops, was conducting the defense with the methodical brilliance that Tywin brought to every enterprise, and that the enterprise's futility did not diminish. Tywin's supplies would last 6 months. The rock's water came from underground springs. The walls were granite, impervious to conventional siege weapons, and the tunnels provided ventilation and communication that no siege could interrupt. "We wait," Stannis wrote from King's Landing. The Raven carried the strategic counsel of a man whose approach to warfare was mathematical rather than emotional, and whose mathematics said, "Time favors the besieger. Starve him. The rock is strong, but food is finite. 6 months and Tywin surrenders or his garrison mutinies." "I am not waiting 6 months," Robert replied by Raven. The reply was the rejection of patience by a man whose character did not include patience, and whose campaign had been fueled by momentum that 6 months of waiting would destroy. "Find me a way in." The way in was found by Tyrion. Tyrion Lannister had ridden west with the army, not as a soldier, but as an advisor. The Lannister whose knowledge of the rock's architecture was intimate and whose intimacy was being offered to the enemy because the enemy was also the king, and because Tyrion's family had been destroyed and the destruction had left Tyrion with no allegiance except the one he chose. And the one he chose was the king who had spared him. "There are passages," Tyrion told Robert and Ned in the command tent. The dwarf was sitting on a camp stool with a wine cup in his hand, and the expression of a man who was betraying his family's greatest secret, and whose betrayal was the only rational response to a family that had treated him as an afterthought, and whose afterthought was now the only Lannister whose counsel the king accepted. The sewers. The drainage tunnels that carry waste from the rock's chambers to the sea. The tunnels are narrow, designed for waste, not for men, but there are junctions where the passages widen, and the junctions connect to the lower levels of the rock's interior. A small force, 20 men, 30 at most, could enter through the sea caves at low tide and follow the drainage tunnels to the kitchens. How do you know this? I spent my childhood exploring every passage in the rock that a boy my size could fit through. The passages designed for waste were passages designed for dwarves. I know the route because the route was my sanctuary, the place where Cersei and my father and the world's contempt could not follow. The infiltration was conducted at night. 30 men, hand-picked soldiers, led by Tyrion and accompanied by Ned, entered the sea caves at the base of the rock during the lowest tide of the month. The caves were wet and dark, and the passage through them was the claustrophobic nightmare that underground military operations always produced. The confined spaces, the fetid air, the awareness that the mountain above was pressing down with a weight that the human mind could calculate, and that the calculation produced panic. Tyrion led. The dwarf moved through the tunnels with the familiarity of a man returning to a childhood home. A strange, wet, malodorous childhood home. But a home nonetheless. The territory that the years of exclusion had made his own, and that the ownership was now being repurposed from refuge to weapon. They emerged in the lower kitchens at dawn. The kitchens were unguarded. The siege's duration had reduced the internal garrison's alertness. The assumption that the rock was impregnable, producing the complacency that impregnable fortresses always produced in their defenders. The infiltrators opened the gates. The gates opened, and Robert's army poured in. The 60,000 who had been waiting outside compressed into the gate's throat and expanding into the rock's courtyards with the force of water through a broken dam. The fighting inside the rock was brutal. Close quarters, stone corridors, the urban warfare that castles produced when the walls were breached and the defenders fell back to the inner positions. The Lannister garrison fought. The garrison fought with the desperation of men defending their home and the futility of men defending a home that was already lost. Tywin Lannister was found in his study. The Old Lion was sitting at his desk when Robert's soldiers broke through the door of the Lord's chambers. The desk was orderly, the papers arranged, the correspondence filed, the administrative precision of a man whose life had been defined by control, and whose control was being terminated by the sound of fighting in the corridors outside. Tywin was dressed in his armor, the red and gold plate, the Lannister colors, the costume of a man who had prepared for the end, and whose preparation was the final expression of the dignity that Tywin placed above all other values. Lord Tywin. Ned entered the study with soldiers at his back and the authority of the Hand who had breached the impregnable fortress. The rock has fallen. Your garrison has surrendered. I am here to accept your surrender and to transport you to King's Landing for the King's judgment. Tywin looked at Ned. The look was the assessment of a man who had spent 40 years judging men and being judged, and whose final judgment was being rendered by a northern lord in a Westerlands castle, and the rendering was the inversion of every expectation that Tywin's life had been built to produce. I do not surrender to you, Lord Stark. I am not your prisoner. I am the prisoner of the circumstances that your truth created, and the circumstances are larger than either of us. The circumstances require your cooperation. You can come willingly, or you can be carried. The outcome is the same. Tywin stood. The standing was not resistance, it was the formality of a man who refused to be taken while sitting, whose pride demanded that the capture be conducted vertically. Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, the man who had rebuilt the Lannister dynasty from his father's incompetence and ruled it for 40 years, was taken from his own study and led through his own castle and marched through his own gates as a prisoner. The march through the gates was the image that the chronicles preserved. The great lord in chains, the fallen lion, the man whose power had been absolute and whose absoluteness had been ended by a truth that his daughter had created and that his daughter's husband had avenged. The old Lion's End Tywin Lannister was brought before Robert in the throne room of the Red Keep. The journey from Casterly Rock to King's Landing had taken 3 weeks. 3 weeks of road and rain, and the slow indignity of a man who had controlled half the realm's wealth being transported as cargo through the realm he had helped to govern. Tywin rode in a covered wagon, not a cell. Ned had insisted on that. The minimum courtesy that a lord of Tywin's stature required, and that the minimum's provision was Ned's way of demonstrating that the king's justice could be administered without the king's cruelty. Robert received Tywin on the Iron Throne. The king was seated in his armor, the Westerlands campaign armor, still dented from the golden tooth, the metal showing the scratches and dents that combat produced, and that Robert had not polished because the damage was evidence, and because the evidence was the point. The king who had fought the war was the king who judged the man who had started it. Tywin Lannister, Robert said, you raised your banners against your king. You fielded an army against the forces of the Iron Throne. You killed soldiers who were serving the crown's justice. These are the acts of a traitor. Tywin stood before the throne in chains. The chains were iron, heavy, functional. The absence of gold that was itself a message about the prisoner's diminished status. Tywin's face showed nothing. The face that had negotiated treaties and commanded armies and terrified lords and small folk alike showed nothing, because the face had been trained across 40 years of politics to show only what its owner chose to display. And its owner chose to display the nothing that was Tywin's final weapon. The composure that refused to validate the proceedings by responding to them emotionally. I defended my family, Tywin said. You murdered my daughter. You imprisoned my son. You exiled my grandchildren. The banners were raised in defense of House Lannister, and the defense was the right of every lord whose family is threatened by the crown. Your daughter committed treason. Your daughter confessed to treason. Your daughter was tried and convicted of treason. The execution was lawful. The imprisonment of your son was lawful. Everything I did was done within the law, and everything you did was done in violation of it. The law. Tywin's voice carried the contempt that Tywin reserved for concepts he found insufficient. The law is the tool that the powerful use to legitimize their actions. You used the law to murder my daughter. I used arms to seek redress. The difference between the two is the difference between hypocrisy and honesty, and I will not apologize for choosing the latter. The exchange was the collision of two men whose wills were matched in strength, and whose strengths were different in kind. Robert's the strength of violence, Tywin's the strength of conviction. The collision produced no resolution, because neither man was capable of conceding to the other, and because the proceedings were not designed for concession, but for judgment. Robert's judgment was execution. Ned argued against it. The argument was the same argument Ned had made for Jaime: spare the man, preserve the peace, avoid creating the martyrdom that execution produced. The argument was weakened by repetition, and by the recognition that Tywin's crimes were different from Jaime's. Jaime had committed a personal betrayal. Tywin had committed a military rebellion. The personal betrayal permitted mercy. The military rebellion demanded consequences. Tywin Lannister declared war on the crown, Stannis said. Stannis had returned from King's Landing for the trial, the heir's presence lending the proceedings the gravitas that the Baratheon succession required. The penalty for treason is death. The penalty has been applied to the daughter. The consistency requires its application to the father. Consistency is not justice, Ned said. Tywin lost the war. His army is broken. His castle is taken. His daughter is dead. His son is at the wall. His grandchildren are exiled. Executing Tywin destroys House Lannister. A destroyed house produces a vacuum. A vacuum produces chaos. The Westerlands without a lord become the Westerlands at war with themselves. The Westerlands have a lord, Stannis replied. Tyrion Lannister is the heir. With Jaime at the wall, the inheritance passes to Tyrion. The dwarf is competent, cooperative, and available. The Westerlands will not lack governance. The argument was settled by Robert. The settlement was the king's prerogative, the authority that the crown vested in the man who wore it, and that the man exercised with the finality that only kings possessed. He dies. The old lion dies. He marched an army against his king. He killed my soldiers. He sat in his castle, while his brother bled at the golden tooth. And when I came to his door, he sat at his desk and waited as if the siege were a tax dispute. He dies, and the dying ends the Lannister rebellion, and the ending is the peace. Tywin Lannister was executed in the courtyard of the Red Keep. The execution was conducted by Sir Ilan Payne, the same executioner who had killed Cersei, the same blade, the same courtyard, the same procedure. The consistency that Stannis had demanded was the consistency that the execution provided. Tywin died as he had lived, without visible emotion, without plea, without the concession that his enemies wanted and that his pride refused. The old lion's last expression was the expression of a man whose contempt for the proceedings exceeded his fear of the outcome, and whose contempt was the only resistance available to a man in chains before a headsman. Tyrion inherited Casterly Rock. The inheritance was formal, the decree signed by Robert, the transfer of titles and lands, and the Lannister legacy that Tywin had spent 40 years building, and that the building's destruction had left to the son that the builder had despised. Tyrion received the inheritance with the complicated emotions of a man whose father's death was simultaneously a liberation and a loss. The freedom from Tywin's judgment, purchased by the permanence of Tywin's absence, the inheritance desired and the death that produced it not desired, the contradiction that all complicated families produced when the patriarch fell. Lord of Casterly Rock, Tyrion said, standing in the courtyard after the execution, with the decree in his hand and the blood on the stones, and the title that his father had never intended him to hold. The one thing my father feared most, the dwarf on his throne. I would drink to the irony, but the irony is too large for wine. Tyrion went west. The new lord of Casterly Rock returned to the castle that his father had defended, and that his father's enemy had taken, and that the enemy's decree had returned to the Lannister line through its least expected member. Tyrion governed the Westerlands with the intelligence that Tywin had possessed, and the humanity that Tywin had lacked. And the combination produced a governance that was different from Tywin's in kind, while being equal to Tywin's in effectiveness. The war was over. The Lannister rebellion had lasted 3 months, the shortest major conflict in the Seven Kingdoms since the first Blackfire Rebellion. The brevity was the product of Robert's aggression and the coalition's size, and Tywin's isolation. The three factors combining to produce a resolution that was swift and decisive and that left the kingdom scarred but functional. The hands-doubt Ned Stark stood in the godswood of the Red Keep and questioned whether the truth had been worth it. The godswood was the only place in King's Landing where Ned felt the presence of the old gods, the weirwood tree. With its red leaves and its carved face, the connection to the north and the tradition and the faith that the South Sept-dominated culture could not provide. Ned came to the godswood when the weight of the decisions required a surface that could hold them. And the surface was the faith, and the faith was the only structure in Ned's life that the truth had not damaged. The truth's cost was a ledger that Ned could read but could not balance. Cersei was dead. The execution was lawful. Ned could not deny the law. But the death haunted him with the persistence of debts unpaid. Cersei had been cruel, ambitious, treasonous. Cersei had also been a mother, a woman whose crime was loving a man who was not her husband, and whose punishment was the blade that Robert's rage had demanded, and that Ned's counsel had failed to prevent. Ned had argued for exile. Robert had chosen death. The choice was Robert's to make, and the choice was made, and the choice could not be unmade. And the inability to unmake it was the weight that pressed on Ned's shoulders in the godswood. Tywin was dead. The execution was the consequence of the war that the execution of Cersei had produced, the chain of violence that began with a truth told in a king's solar and ended with a lord's head on a block. Ned had argued for mercy. Robert had chosen death. The pattern was forming. The pattern of a king whose response to every crisis was violence, and whose violence was effective, and whose effectiveness was producing a kingdom held together by fear rather than justice. You're brooding. Robert's voice came from the path behind the weirwood. The king had come to the godswood, unusual for Robert, whose relationship with the gods was adversarial when it existed at all. Robert was in a linen shirt, no armor, a wine cup in his hand. The cup was the constant, the presence that accompanied Robert the way Ghost accompanied Jon Snow at the wall, the companion whose company was both comfort and destruction. I'm thinking. In the north, the two are the same thing. I'm thinking about whether telling you the truth was the right decision. Robert's face shifted. The shift was the reaction of a man confronting a challenge he had not expected. Not a military challenge or a political one, but a personal one. The friend, questioning the foundation of the action that had defined the last 6 months. You're wondering if you should have kept it from me. I'm wondering what would have happened if I had. If I'd warned Cersei instead. If I'd given her the chance to flee. If the truth had never reached you. Then I'd still be married to a woman who was bedding her brother and raising his bastards as my heirs. I'd still be the fool. I'd still be alive without blood on your hands. Alive without 2 executions. Alive without a war. Alive as a cuckold. Alive as a joke. Ned, the truth was the only thing you could have told me. You are Ned Stark. You do not lie. You do not conceal. You did not come south to protect me from information. You came south to serve the realm. And the realm required the truth. The realm required the truth. I am not certain the realm required the consequences. The consequences are mine, not yours. I chose the sentence for Cersei. I chose the war against Tywin. I chose the execution. The truth was your contribution. Everything that followed the truth was my decision, and my decisions are my burden. Your decisions were informed by my truth. The truth created the conditions. The conditions produced the decisions. The relationship between the two cannot be severed. The truth and the consequences are one thing, not two. Robert sat on the bench beside the weirwood. The sitting was the gesture of a man whose friend was in distress, and whose distress required presence rather than argument. Robert was not an empathetic man. Robert's empathy was the blunt instrument of a man who cared through proximity rather than understanding. The friend who showed up sat down and occupied the space that loneliness would otherwise fill. Would you do it again? Robert asked. Ned considered. The consideration was the honest assessment of a man whose moral framework was being tested by the gap between principle and outcome. The recognition that the truth was right and the consequences were terrible, and that the rightness and the terribleness coexisted without resolving. Yes, I would tell you again. Then, stop brooding. You told the truth. I acted on it. The acting produced costs. The costs are paid. And the kingdom is standing, which is more than the kingdom would be if the truth had stayed buried and Cersei had continued and the Lannister deception had produced a Lannister king on the Iron Throne. The kingdom is standing on blood. All kingdoms stand on blood. The question is whose blood, and whether the bleeding produced something worth bleeding for. I think it did. The realm knows the truth. The realm has a legitimate king. The realm is at peace. Those things matter, Ned. Even if the cost was high, the things they produced matter. Ned did not answer. The non-answer was the Northern Lord's concession, the acknowledgement that Robert's argument was sound without the verbal confirmation that the soundness deserved, because the verbal confirmation would have absolved Ned of the responsibility that Ned believed he carried, and that the absolution was too easy and too soon. The two men sat in the godswood, the king and his hand, the warrior and the lord, the friends whose friendship had been tested by the truth, and whose friendship had survived the testing, because the friendship was older than the truth, and deeper than the consequences, and stronger than the doubt that the consequences had produced. The second Queen Robert married Margaery Tyrell. The marriage was not romance. The marriage was transaction. The payment that the Tyrells had been waiting for since they committed 60,000 swords to Robert's campaign. The prize that Olenna had demanded and that the campaign's success had made impossible to refuse. Margaery was 16. Robert was 35. The gap was the gap that political marriages always produced. The distance between youth and experience, between beauty and power, between the woman who was being offered and the man who was receiving. She's a child, Robert told Ned. They were in the king's solar, the same room where Ned had told Robert the truth about Cersei, the room that had become the site of every conversation that mattered, and that the conversations had transformed from a dining room into a confessional. She's the key to the Reach. The Tyrells provided the army that won the war. The Tyrells are providing the grain that's feeding the kingdom. The marriage secures their loyalty and produces the heir that the kingdom requires. I've had one marriage. The marriage was a prison. I'm being asked to enter a second prison with a prettier jailer. Margaery Tyrell is not Cersei Lannister. The Tyrells are not the Lannisters. And the kingdom needs a queen and an heir, and the need is greater than your reluctance. Robert married Margaery in the Great Sept of Baelor. The ceremony was lavish, the Tyrell wealth on display, the flowers and the music and the pageantry that the Reach brought to every occasion, and that the occasion required, because the marriage was not merely a union of two people, but a union of two houses, and the union's public demonstration was as important as its private reality. Margaery was beautiful. The observation was universal. The young queen, with her brown curls and her warm smile, and her ability to make every person in a room feel that her attention was directed specifically at them, was a politician of natural genius, whose genius operated through charm rather than manipulation. Margaery's charm was not Cersei's. Cersei's had been the sharp weapon of a woman who controlled through fear. Margaery's was the warm invitation of a woman who controlled through affection. The distinction was the difference between a blade and a hand was more effective. Robert tolerated the marriage. The toleration was not happiness. Robert Baratheon had never been happy in marriage, and the second marriage did not alter the fundamental incompatibility between Robert's character and the institution of matrimony. Robert drank. Robert hunted. Robert spent his nights in the company of women who were not his wife, though the spending was less frequent than it had been during the Cersei years, because Margaery's presence in the court produced a surveillance that Cersei's contempt had not. Margaery managed Robert the way a gardener managed a wild hedge, with patience, with indirect intervention, with the understanding that the hedge would grow as it grew, and that the gardener's role was to shape the growth rather than to prevent it. Margaery did not challenge Robert. Margaery did not confront Robert. Margaery redirected Robert, the gentle redirection that was the Tyrell method, and that produced results through suggestion rather than conflict. The heir came in the second year of the marriage. A boy, black-haired, blue-eyed, the Baratheon colouring that the Lannister children had lacked, and that the heir's presence demonstrated. Robert named the boy John, after Jon Arryn, the hand whose murder had started the chain of events that produced the truth, and whose truth had produced the war, and whose war had produced the peace in which the boy was born. Prince Jon Baratheon, the name was the memorial, the recognition that the Dead Hand's investigation had preserved the Baratheon dynasty by destroying the Lannister deception, and that the preservation deserved the honor of a firstborn son's name. Robert held the boy and felt nothing. The nothing was the emptiness, the void that the truth had opened, and that the war had widened, and that the marriage had not filled. Robert had held 3 children before this one, Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, and the holding had produced the warmth that fathers felt, and that the warmth's falseness had retroactively poisoned. Robert held Prince Jon and searched for the warmth and found the nothing, and the nothing was the truth's final consequence. The man whose trust had been destroyed by one set of children could not fully trust the next. "He's yours," Margaery said. She was watching from the bed, the exhaustion of birth mixed with the alertness of a woman who read faces, and whose reading of Robert's face was producing concern. "He has your eyes, your hair. He's yours, Robert, I know. Then hold him like he's yours." Robert held the boy. The holding was the effort, the deliberate action of a man whose instincts had been damaged by betrayal and whose damage was being addressed through will rather than feeling. Robert held the boy, and the boy cried, and the crying was the ordinary sound of a newborn, and the ordinary sound was, in its ordinariness, the beginning of the healing that Robert's character had not yet admitted it required. The spider's last web, Petyr Baelish, was arrested in the 4th year of Prince Jon's life. The arrest was Varys's masterwork, the patient, meticulous deconstruction of a network that had taken Baelish 20 years to build, and that Varys had spent 3 years documenting with the thoroughness that the spider brought to every enterprise. The documentation produced a picture of corruption, manipulation, and murder that stretched from the Eyrie to King's Landing, and that implicated Baelish in crimes that the charm and the smile and the self-deprecating wit had concealed for 2 decades. The critical evidence was the testimony of a former servant of Jon Arryn's household, a woman named Marillion, who had served in the Arryn household during the period of Jon Arryn's illness, and who had observed Lysa Arryn administering the tears of Luz to her husband's wine at Petyr Baelish's instruction. The testimony was corroborated by Lysa herself, or rather, by Lysa's ravings, which had been recorded by the Erie's maester, and which contained, amid the paranoia and the grief and the unhinged devotion to Baelish, the confession that Lysa had poisoned Jon Arryn because Petyr had asked her to, and because Petyr's asking was the command that Lysa's obsession could not refuse. Jon Arryn had been murdered. The murder was not committed by the Lannisters. The murder was committed by the man who stood beside the throne and whispered counsel and managed the finances, and positioned himself as the indispensable advisor whose indispensability was the product of the chaos he had created. Baelish was arrested in his chambers in the Red Keep. The arrest was conducted by Ned, not the guards, not the King's Guard, but the Hand himself, because the man who had told Robert the truth about Cersei intended to tell Robert the truth about Baelish, and the telling required the teller's presence. "Lord Baelish, you are charged with the murder of Jon Arryn, Hand of the King, through the instrumentality of his wife Lysa. You are charged with the embezzlement of the Crown's treasury during your tenure as Master of Coin. You are charged with conspiracy to destabilize the realm through the manufacture of discord between houses Stark and Lannister. You are charged with treason." Baelish's face showed the calculation, the rapid assessment of a man whose survival had always depended on his ability to find the exit, and whose assessment was, for the first time, producing no exit. The evidence was too thorough. The witnesses were too credible. The net was too complete. "Lord Stark," Baelish said. The voice was the charm, the warm, self-deprecating tone that Baelish used the way soldiers used shields, the surface that deflected the attacks that his opponents delivered. "You are making a mistake. I have served the Crown faithfully for you murdered the Hand who came before me. You poisoned him through a woman whose love you exploited and whose sanity you destroyed. You created the crisis that brought me south. You manufactured the conflict between my family and the Lannisters that produced a war. Every death in the Westerlands, every soldier who fell at the Golden Tooth, every man who died at Casterly Rock is a death that your conspiracy produced. The evidence is overwhelming. The testimony is corroborated. The ledgers have been examined by Stannis and by 3 independent accountants, and the examination has revealed a deficit of 2 million gold dragons that your financial instruments concealed, and that the concealment was embezzlement, not investment. Baelish was tried. The trial was brief, the evidence was comprehensive, the testimony was damning. And Baelish's defense was the defense of a man whose tools were manipulation, and whose manipulation required an audience susceptible to it, and whose audience, the Lords of the Realm, informed by Varys's documentation and Ned's presentation, was not susceptible. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. Baelish died on the same block where Cersei had died and where Tywin had died, the block that was becoming the stage on which the truth's consequences were performed, and that the performances were the justice that the truth demanded. He killed Jon Arryn, Robert said, watching the execution from the gallery. The man who raised me. The man who taught me everything I know about being a man. Baelish killed him to start a war between me and the Lannisters, to create chaos, to profit from the burning. Yes, if he'd succeeded, if you hadn't told me the truth, if the Lannisters had held the throne, Baelish would have been the man behind the curtain. The puppet master. The man who pulled the strings while the puppets danced. Yes, then, the truth was worth telling. The truth saved us from that man. Whatever the truth cost, the executions, the war, the blood, the truth saved the kingdom from petty Baelish, and the saving was worth the cost. Ned did not answer. The silence was the recognition that Robert's conclusion was correct, and that the correctness did not erase the cost, and that the cost and the correctness coexisted without reconciling. The way the truth and its consequences coexisted without reconciling, the way the living and the dead coexisted in the memory of a man whose decisions had produced both. The hand goes home. Ned Stark resigned the handship in the 6th year of Robert's renewed reign. The resignation was not a crisis. The resignation was the natural conclusion of a tenure that had accomplished what it set out to accomplish, and that the accomplishment's completion permitted. Ned had come south because Robert asked him to. Ned had discovered the truth. Ned had managed the consequences. Ned had fought the war and rebuilt the peace and arrested the spider and sat beside the king through the daily, grinding work of governance that followed the excitement and that the excitement's absence made unbearable. Ned was tired. The tiredness was not physical. The Northern Lord's body was still strong. The constitution that the North's climate had built still functional. But the tiredness of the spirit, the erosion that King's Landing produced in men whose characters were not designed for its politics, and whose politics demanded a performance that Ned's sincerity could not sustain. "I want to go home," Ned told Robert. They were in the Solar, the room that had witnessed the truth and the rage and the decisions and the consequences, the room that had become the geography of their friendship's most intensive period. "Cat is at Winterfell. The children are growing without me. Rob is 20 and governing the North in my absence. And the governing is competent, but the son needs the father, and the father needs the son. You're leaving me. I'm going home. The distinction matters. The distinction is that you're leaving, and I'm staying, and the staying will be harder without you. The staying will be different. You have Stannis. You have Margaery. You have a son who needs a father, who is present. And the presence is more important than anything I can provide from the Hand's Tower." Robert considered. The consideration was the assessment of a man who recognized the truth in his friend's words, and whose recognition was accompanied by the resistance that recognition always produced when the truth was unwelcome. "You're the only honest man in this city. Then the city needs more honest men. You can find them. You have the authority and the judgment. Use both. My judgment is questionable. Your judgment is better than you think. The war was won because your judgment about tactics was sound. The peace is holding because your judgment about Tyrion was sound. The marriage is producing an heir because your judgment about the Tyrells was sound. Trust your judgment, Robert. It is stronger than you credit. My judgment told me that Cersei loved me. Your judgment told you that the marriage would work. The marriage was never designed to work. It was designed to produce alliances. Marriages of alliance are not marriages of love, and the confusion between the two is not a failure of judgment. It is a failure of expectation. Robert smiled. The smile was the rare expression, the genuine warmth that Robert Baratheon's face produced when the face's owner was in the company of the one person whose presence produced warmth rather than the performance of warmth. The smile was Ned's. The smile had always been Ned's. Go home, Ned. Go to Winterfell. Hug your wife. Train your sons. Hunt in the Wolfswood. Do the things that make you the man I called South, and do them in the place that made you that man. I will. And come back. When I'm dying, when the wine and the boars and the women finally do what 15 years of trying couldn't, come back and stand at my bedside and tell me the truth one last time. What truth? That I was a good king. Or a terrible one. Whichever it is. I'll want to know. You were both. All kings are both. That's the most diplomatic thing you've ever said. You're getting soft. I'm getting old. We're both getting old. The difference is that you're getting old in Winterfell, which is dignified, and I'm getting old on the Iron Throne, which is ridiculous. Ned left King's Landing on a morning when the weather was mild and the road was dry, and the conditions were as favorable for departure as conditions ever were. The departure was not ceremonial. Ned had refused the ceremony, the honor guard, the formal farewell that the court would have provided, and that the court's provision would have been the performance of grief by people whose grief was professional rather than genuine. Robert walked Ned to the gate. The walk was the private farewell, the two men, the king and the former hand, walking through the corridors of the Red Keep together for the last time in the daily proximity that the positions had required and that the departure was ending. Take care of my kingdom, Ned said. Take care of my north, Robert replied. The farewell was simple. The simplicity was the friendship, the economy of language that old friends employed when the words were insufficient, and the silence between the words carried the meaning that the words could not. Ned rode north. The King's Road stretched before him. The long road. The familiar road. The road that led from the heat and the politics and the blood of King's Landing to the cold and the honesty and the peace of Winterfell. The road was long. The road was home. Catelyn met him at the gates. The meeting was the embrace that Ned had been imagining for 6 years, the arms around his neck, the scent of her hair. The warmth of a woman whose love was not political, and whose presence was not performance, and whose embrace was the destination that the entire King's Road was the approach to. It's done, Ned said. You told him the truth, and the truth produced a war, and the war produced a peace, and the peace is holding. The peace is holding. Then you did what you went south to do. And now, you're home. Now I'm home. Ned Stark dismounted at Winterfell and walked through the gates and felt the cold of the north settle on his shoulders like the cloak it was. The cold that was not punishment, but protection. The temperature that preserved what the south's heat corrupted. The climate that had built the character that had told the truth and survived the consequences and carried the weight of both. The wolves at peace, the Stark children, grew up without a war to define them. Robb governed the north during Ned's absence, with the steady hand that a 20-year-old could provide when the 20-year-old had been trained by Ned Stark and advised by Maester Luwin and supported by bannermen whose loyalty to the Stark name was older than the bannermen themselves. Robb held court at Winterfell, heard petitions, settled border disputes between minor lords, managed the northern supply contributions to Robert's western campaign, and the managing was the education that no amount of instruction could replicate. Governance was learned through governing, and Robb learned. When Ned returned from King's Landing, the transition was not the return of a lord to a poorly managed domain. The transition was the return of a lord to a domain that had been managed competently, and whose competent management was the proof that the next generation was ready for the responsibility that the current generation would eventually pass down. You've done well, Ned told Robb. reviewing the accounts and the correspondence and the records that Robb's tenure had produced. Maester Luwin did most of the work. Maester Luwin advises. The Lord decides. The decisions were yours, and the decisions were sound. You should trust that. You've never said that before. You've never earned it before. Now you have. Robb married 2 years after Ned's return. The bride was Winifred Manderly, the eldest granddaughter of Lord Wyman, the match that united Winterfell with the North's wealthiest and most commercially connected house. The marriage was Catelyn's orchestration, the mother whose understanding of Northern politics had been refined by 20 years in the North, and whose refinement produced a matchmaking judgment that balanced affection with alliance. Robb and Winifred's wedding was held at White Harbour, the concession to the Manderleys that Catelyn insisted upon and that Ned accepted with the understanding that the bride's family deserved the honour and that the honour's granting cemented the loyalty that the match was designed to produce. The wedding was northern in character, ale instead of arbor gold, roasted aurochs instead of peacock. The direwolf and the merman joined in a ceremony that the old gods witnessed and the new gods blessed, and the guests celebrated with the northern enthusiasm that southern weddings lacked, and that northern weddings compensated for with volume. The marriage produced children. A son, Eddard, named for the grandfather whose name carried the weight of honour across the north, was born in the first year. A daughter, Liara, followed 2 years later. The children were the continuation, the Stark line extending into the generation that would never know the war that might have consumed their father, and that the war's absence permitted their existence. Robb governed alongside his father for 3 years before Ned began delegating entire seasons' worth of lordship to his son. The transition was deliberate, the gradual transfer of authority that Ned had observed in other houses and that the observation had taught him was better managed as an evolution than as a sudden succession. Robb held the harvest courts. Robb rode the borders. Robb adjudicated the disputes between the mountain clans that Ned had managed for 20 years and that the managing had been the unglamorous foundation of northern stability. When do I stop being the lord in training and start being the lord? Robb asked during one of the transitions. When I stop breathing. Until then, you are learning. I've been learning for 10 years, and you will learn for 10 more. The North is patient. The Lord of the North must be more patient still. Winifred understood the arrangement without resenting it. The Manderley pragmatism, the merchant family's instinct for long-term investment, translated into a wife who recognized that Robb's apprenticeship under Ned was the foundation that Robb's independent lordship would build upon, and that the building required the foundation's completion before the walls could rise. Sansa's path was the path that Catelyn had always envisioned. The Southern marriage. The Great House Alliance, the daughter whose beauty and courtesy were the diplomatic instruments that Catelyn's own marriage had demonstrated could be deployed. But the deployment was different from what Catelyn had planned during the days when Robert had come to Winterfell seeking a hand. Sansa was not sent south as a child bride to a boy king whose legitimacy was a lie. Sansa grew up at Winterfell, her beauty sharpening into the angular elegance that the Tully features produced in northern climate, her courtesy refined by Septa Mordane's instruction, and by the letters that she exchanged with the high-born daughters of houses throughout the Seven Kingdoms. At 17, Sansa travelled to Highgarden for a tourney hosted by the Tyrells, and returned with an understanding, not yet a betrothal, but the recognition between families that connected the Starks to Willas Tyrell, the eldest son. The horseman whose crippled leg had not diminished his mind, and whose mind impressed Sansa more than any knight's lance could have. The betrothal was formalized a year later. Ned consented with the reluctant acceptance of a father whose daughter was choosing to live 1,000 leagues south, and whose choosing was her right, and whose right Ned honored even when the honoring cost him. Highgarden is far from Winterfell, Ned said. So is King's Landing, and you spent 6 years there. I spent 6 years there because the king needed me. You're going to Highgarden because you want to. Is wanting less valid than being needed? Ned considered his daughter, the red hair, the blue eyes, the Tully colouring that was Catelyn's gift, and that the gift's recipient was carrying south to a garden rather than a throne. Sansa was not the child who had dreamed of princes. Sansa was the woman who had chosen a man whose virtues were intellectual rather than martial, and whose choice reflected the maturity that the years at Winterfell had produced. No, wanting is not less valid. Go to Highgarden, be happy, and write to your mother. Every week, every day, your mother will accept nothing less. Arya refused every proposal. The refusal was consistent, emphatic, and delivered with the directness that Arya brought to every interaction, and that the interaction's recipients found either refreshing or exhausting, depending on whether the recipients were proposing marriage or proposing something else. Catelyn produced candidates, the Blackwood heir, the younger Karstark boy. Even a tentative inquiry from House Dane that arrived by Raven and was answered by Arya before Catelyn could compose a diplomatic response. No, Arya said. The word was the entire letter. Catelyn added pleasantries in a follow-up Raven and resolved to intercept Arya's correspondence in the future. Arya's path was not marriage. Arya's path was the one she carved, training at arms with the household guard, riding the Wolfswood with a small sword at her hip and Nymeria loping beside her, travelling to Bear Island where Mage Mormont's daughters showed her that a woman with a weapon was not an anomaly, but a tradition. At 19, Arya sailed to Braavos, not to the House of Black and White, whose existence she did not know, but to the free city itself, the merchant republic that Syrio Forel had described during the lessons that Ned had arranged in King's Landing, and that the lessons' description had planted a seed that 6 years of northern winters had not killed. Arya returned from Braavos fluent in Braavosi, competent in water dancing, and utterly uninterested in the domestic arrangements that Catelyn continued to suggest with the persistence that mothers brought to the project of their daughters' marriages. She is your daughter, Catelyn told Ned. She is our daughter. The stubbornness is yours. The stubbornness is yours. The refusal to conform is yours. Everything about that girl that drives me to distraction is yours. Then you should blame me. But I notice you're not actually distressed. I am distressed. I am also proud. The two are not incompatible. Bran climbed everything. The walls of Winterfell, the towers, the roofs, the ancient stones that no one had touched since the castle was built, and that Bran's fingers found with the sureness of a boy whose body was designed for vertical surfaces, and whose design's purpose the gods had provided without explanation. Catelyn forbade the climbing. Ned forbade the climbing. Bran climbed. No one fell. No one pushed the boy from a tower window because no one was in Winterfell's towers conducting the affair that required the pushing. Bran climbed and descended and grew into a young man whose agility was extraordinary and whose extraordinary gift was channeled, eventually, into service. The scouts and the rangers who served the Night's Watch, and whose service required men who could scale walls and traverse terrain that defeated ordinary soldiers. Bran did not take the black. Bran visited the wall at 16, rode north with a supply convoy that Ned organized after Robert's increased investment in the Watch, and spent a month at Castle Black learning the terrain and the practices and the landscape beyond the wall that the Rangers described with the mixture of reverence and fear that the landscape produced. He returned to Winterfell changed. The boy who had climbed for the joy of climbing now understood that climbing could serve a purpose beyond itself, and that the purpose was waiting for the moment when the North required it. Bran also returned with dreams, strange dreams, dreams of three-eyed ravens and weirwood roots and a darkness beneath the ice that the dream's imagery suggested was real and whose reality Bran could not confirm and whose confirmation he did not seek. The dreams faded as dreams did, or they waited, as some dreams did, for the season that would make them urgent. Rickon grew wild. The youngest Stark had the temperament that youngest children sometimes developed, the fierceness that came from being the last, the need to be louder and bolder because the older siblings had already claimed the available territory of family identity. Rickon's wolf, Shaggy Dog, was the fiercest of the direwolves, and the fierceness was the bond between boy and beast that the bonding produced, each reinforcing the other's wildness, each tempering the other's excesses through the companionship that did not require words. Ned watched his children grow. The watching was the privilege that the truth had purchased, the payment that Robert's war and Cersei's execution and Tywin's death had funded. The years at Winterfell that Ned had earned through the years at King's Landing, and that the earnings price had been the blood of others. The watching was also the guilt. The awareness that the peaceful childhood his children enjoyed was purchased with the disrupted childhoods of Cersei's children. The golden trio sent to Casterly Rock, the Lannister heirs whose mother was dead and whose grandfather was dead, and whose displacement from King's Landing was the direct result of the truth that Ned had told. Jon Snow remained at Winterfell. The bastard, the name that Ned had given to protect the boy whose real name was a secret that Ned carried beneath every other secret, grew up in the castle alongside his siblings with the quiet differentiation that bastard status produced in Westeros and that Ned's affection could not fully compensate. Catelyn's coldness toward Jon had not warmed with the years. The coldness was not cruelty. It was the frost of a woman who saw in Jon the evidence of a husband's infidelity, and whose evidence was a daily presence, and whose presence was a daily reminder. Ned considered telling Catelyn the truth about Jon. The consideration arose every year, the impulse to end the deception, to explain that Jon was Lyanna's son and not the product of Ned's faithlessness, to remove the frost that the deception maintained between Catelyn and the boy. Every year, Ned chose silence. The silence was protection. Robert's hatred of the Targaryens, even with Cersei dead and the Lannisters crushed, was a furnace that mention of Rhaegar's son would rekindle. The silence was also habit. 14 years, 15, 16 of carrying the secret had transformed the carrying from active choice to passive condition. The weight so familiar that setting it down seemed more dangerous than continuing to bear it. Jon joined the Night's Watch at 18. The decision was his own. The bastard's recognition that Winterfell's future belonged to Robb and Robb's children, and that the bastard's place in the future was the place he made elsewhere. Ned did not stop him. Ned rode to the Wall with Jon, the two of them on the King's Road together, the journey that was also a farewell, and that the farewell's privacy, father and son, the road, the north, permitted the honesty that Winterfell's crowded halls did not. "You are my blood," Ned told Jon at the Wall's gate. "Whatever you believe about your mother, whatever the world says about your name, you are my blood. Remember that. I will." Ned rode south from the Wall alone. The riding was the return from the last departure, the final child launched, the final obligation of fatherhood fulfilled. The long ride home to Winterfell, where Catelyn waited, and where the Godswood waited, and where the silence waited that Ned filled with the thoughts he could share with no one. The direwolves stayed. Grey wind padded through Winterfell at Robb's heel, the beast enormous now, the size of a small horse, the grey fur bristling when strangers approached and settling when the household's familiar scents registered. Lady remained Sansa's shadow until Sansa departed for Highgarden, and then the wolf howled, 3 nights of howling. The sound carrying across the castle and waking servants who had grown accustomed to the wolf's presence and who found the absence of one wolf's silence louder than the remaining wolves' noise. Lady settled eventually. The wolf took to lying in the godswood beside the heart tree, as if waiting, and the waiting became the wolf's permanent posture. The patient vigil of an animal whose bond transcended distance, and whose bond's other half was living among roses 1,000 miles south. Nymeria ran. Arya's wolf was the wild one, the beast that disappeared into the wolfswood for weeks at a time and returned with blood on her muzzle and the satisfied bearing of a predator whose hunting grounds extended from the walls of Winterfell to the foothills of the northern mountains. When Arya sailed for Braavos, Nymeria remained, the wolf who would not board a ship, who stood on the dock at White Harbour and refused, and whose refusal was the final confirmation that the wolf was northern in a way that transcended the bond with her mistress. Nymeria returned to the wolfswood and became the legend that the northern smallfolk told stories about, the great wolf, the direwolf, the beast that led a pack of 100 common wolves through forests that men avoided and whose avoidance was wisdom. Summer and Shaggy Dog grew alongside their boys. Bran's wolf and Rickon's wolf, the calm and the wild, the patient and the furious, were the paired expressions of the Stark temperament's range, the spectrum from Ned's stillness to Lyanna's wildness contained in two animals whose coexistence in the castle's walls was the daily negotiation between order and chaos that the Starks had always embodied. 6 direwolves had been found by a dead mother near the King's Road. 6 had survived. In another life, the life where Ned went south to serve and the serving destroyed him, the wolves would have been scattered, killed, lost. In this life, the wolves grew old at Winterfell, and the growing was the proof that some gifts, when protected, endured. The stag in winter Robert Baratheon reigned for 19 years after the Lannister rebellion. 19 years of governance that was adequate without being distinguished, the rule of a man whose talents were martial and whose peacetime kingship was the management of boredom rather than the management of a kingdom. The kingdom was managed by others, Stannis as Hand, Margaery as Queen, the small council members who administered the 7 kingdoms while the king administered his appetites. Robert drank. The drinking was the constant, the companion that had accompanied Robert through the rebellion and the kingship and the truth and the war and the marriage and every other phase of his life, and that the phase's passage did not diminish. The drinking was worse after the Westerlands campaign, because the campaign had given Robert the last war he would ever fight, and the last war's conclusion was the beginning of the permanent peace that Robert's character could not tolerate. Peace was the enemy that Robert could not defeat, because defeat required violence, and peace was the absence of violence, and the absence was the opponent that Robert's talents could not engage. Prince John grew. The boy, black-haired, blue-eyed, the image of Robert in miniature, grew into a child, and the child grew into a boy, and the boy showed the temperament that Margaery's influence and Stannis's discipline and Robert's occasional attention produced, measured, intelligent, capable of the restraint that Robert lacked, and the warmth that Stannis lacked, and the combination that neither could provide but that the boy absorbed from the environment that both created. A second child came, a girl named Cassana after Robert's mother, who had died when Robert was young. The girl was Margaery's image, brown-haired, warm-eyed, the Tyrell colouring asserting itself in the second generation the way the Baratheon colouring had asserted itself in the first. Robert held Cassana with less of the hesitation that had marked his holding of Prince John, the healing that time provided, the slow reconstruction of the trust that Cersei's betrayal had destroyed. Renly governed Storm's End with the charm and the competence that Renly brought to every position, and that the position's requirements could not exceed. Renly's ambitions remained, the youngest brother's desire for more than the youngest brother's portion, but the ambitions were contained by the reality that Stannis was heir, and Jon was Stannis's heir, and the line of succession was stable and uncontestable. The wall was reinforced. Robert, whose brief correspondence with Jaime Lannister at Castle Black had produced the unexpected result of the king becoming interested in the Watch's reports, committed resources to the Night's Watch that no previous king had committed. The commitment was not generosity. It was the paranoia of a man whose trust had been comprehensively betrayed, and whose betrayal had produced a hypervigilance that extended to every corner of the kingdom, including the corners that previous kings had ignored. Jaime served at the Wall. The Kingslayer, stripped of his title, his lands, his name's golden resonance, became a brother of the Night's Watch, and served with the competence that his martial training provided and the bitterness that his sentence demanded. Jaime did not find redemption at the Wall. Jaime found cold and duty and the daily routine of a military organization whose simplicity was the antithesis of the court's complexity, and whose antithesis was, over the years, a comfort that Jaime would never have admitted to, and that the admission's absence did not negate. The kingdom endured. The endurance was not glorious. The chronicles of Robert's reign did not record a golden age or a renaissance, or any of the superlatives that historians applied to exceptional periods. The chronicles recorded a stable period, the taxes collected, the roads maintained, the justice administered, the borders defended, the ordinary machinery of governance operating with the ordinary efficiency that ordinary governance produced. Robert hunted. The hunting was the escape, the forests and the fields and the open air that Robert's character required, and that the Red Keep's corridors could not provide. Robert hunted boar and stag and bear and everything that the Kingswood and the royal forests contained. And the hunting was the activity that consumed the energy that the kingship could not absorb. Margaery managed the court, the Queen's social intelligence, the inherited Tyrell talent for relationships, amplified by Margaery's own gifts, maintained the alliances and the courtesies and the complex web of obligations that the Seven Kingdoms' governance required. Margaery was not Cersei. The distinction was the dynasty's salvation, a queen who built rather than schemed, who connected rather than divided, who treated the court as a garden rather than a battlefield. Ned visited twice. The visits were brief, the northern lord riding south for royal occasions and returning north with the urgency of a man whose tolerance for King's Landing was measured in days rather than weeks. The visits confirmed what the distance could not. The friendship between Robert and Ned was intact, damaged, but intact, the foundation cracked by the truth's consequences, but holding under the weight of 30 years of shared history. "You look old," Robert told Ned during the second visit. "You look fat. I am fat. You are old. We are both in decline. The question is, which of us declines faster? You. The wine will see to it. The wine is the only thing keeping me alive. Without the wine, the boredom would kill me. The wine at least provides variety, different vintages, different headaches, different excuses for missing the small council. You should stop drinking. You should stop being honest. We are both incapable of the thing the other suggests." The king's last hunt, Robert died in the 24th year of his reign. The death was not an assassination. The death was not a bore. The irony that history had been denied by Ned's decision to tell the truth before the hunt rather than after it. The death was the accumulation of 24 years of excess. The wine and the food and the inactivity and the systematic abuse of a body that had been magnificent and that the abuse had reduced to the large, failing mechanism that age and indulgence combined to produce. Robert's heart failed during a hunt in the Kingswood. The failure was not dramatic. No charging boar, no tragic combat, no the king fell fighting the beast that the bards would have preferred. Robert was riding through the forest on a warm afternoon, pursuing a stag that his huntsman had spotted. And the riding produced a pain in his chest that the pain's severity identified as terminal, and that Robert recognized with the soldier's assessment of a wound that could not be survived. "Ned." The word was the first word Robert spoke when the pain arrived. The word was not addressed to anyone present. Ned was at Winterfell, 1,000 miles north, but the word was the instinct, the reflex. The name that Robert's mind produced when the mind confronted crisis. The friend whose presence the dying man wanted, and whose absence the dying man could not remedy. Robert was carried back to the hunting lodge. The carrying was the indignity. The king's body, too heavy for comfort, transported on a litter by men, whose expressions showed the horror that the king's condition produced, and that the condition's severity made undeniable. The maesters were summoned. The maesters could do nothing. The heart that had been stressed beyond its capacity for decades was failing, and the failure was irreversible. Robert died in the hunting lodge at sunset. Margaery was at his side, the queen who had managed him and endured him and cared for him in the way that she cared for everything, with the warm efficiency that was the Tyrell contribution to the dynasty. Stannis was at his side, the brother whose duty brought him, and whose duty was the only force strong enough to overcome his discomfort with emotion. Renly was at his side, the youngest brother, the charming one, the one whose grief was the most visibly genuine, because Renly's emotions, unlike Stannis's, were not constrained by the architecture of self-discipline. "Tell Ned," Robert said. The instruction was delivered in the fading voice of a man whose body was shutting down, and whose priorities were narrowing to the essential. Tell Ned he was right, about everything. The truth, the cost, the kingdom. He was right. About what, specifically? Stannis asked. About everything. Stannis, you are the worst person to deliver a deathbed message. You want specifics from a dying man. I want clarity. The clarity is this. I was a terrible king and a great warrior, and the difference between the two is the tragedy of my life. Ned understood that. Ned saw it from the beginning. Tell him I knew. At the end, I knew. Robert Baratheon died. The king's last breath was the exhalation of a man whose life had been defined by the gap between what he was and what the throne required, the warrior who sat a politician's chair, the fighter who held a diplomat's scepter, the man of action imprisoned in a role that demanded patience. The gap had been the source of every failure and the explanation for every success, and the gap remained open at the end, the permanent space between Robert and the throne that not even death could close. Prince Jon Baratheon was crowned 3 days later. The boy was 10, too young for the crown, old enough for the ceremony, the right age for the regency that Stannis would provide, and that the regency's provision was the final service that Stannis Baratheon, the unwanted heir who never inherited, contributed to the dynasty. Ned received the raven at Winterfell. The raven carried the news, Robert is dead, and the instruction, he said to tell you that you were right about everything. Ned read the message in the godswood, beneath the weirwood tree, in the cold that preserved, and the silence that honored, and the solitude that grief required. The grief was real. The grief was the loss of the friend, the loss of Robert, who had been many things and most of them contradictory, and all of them vivid, and the vividness was the quality that Robert's absence removed from the world. The world without Robert was a quieter world, a more orderly world, a world that functioned better and felt worse. And the feeling was the cost that Robert's death extracted from the people who had known him. Ned wept. The weeping was the Northern Lord's private expression, the tears that fell in the godswood where no one could see them, and that the old gods witnessed, and that the old gods did not judge. Ned wept for the friend and the king, and the man who had called him south, and whose calling had changed everything. The kingdom, the dynasty, the lives of thousands of people whose existence had been shaped by the truth that Ned had told, and the consequences that the truth had produced. The truth's price there is a plaque in the Great Hall of the Red Keep. The plaque is small, bronze, mounted on the wall beside the door to the Hand's Tower, positioned at eye level for the men who walk through the door and who hold the office that the door leads to. The inscription reads, "The truth serves the realm. The realm demands the truth." The plaque was Ned's commission. He ordered it placed after he resigned the handship. The memorial to the principle that had guided his tenure, and that the tenure's consequences had tested, and that the testing had not destroyed. The truth was told. The truth was expensive. The truth's price was a queen's life, and a lord's life, and a war's dead, and a king's damaged capacity for trust, and a hand's permanent doubt about whether the telling was worth the price. The answer is, it was. The answer is complicated by the cost, and by the recognition that the cost was borne by people who did not choose to bear it. Cersei, whose crimes were real, but whose execution was the product of a king's rage rather than a court's deliberation. Tywin, whose rebellion was the response of a father rather than a traitor. The soldiers at the Golden Tooth and Casterly Rock, whose deaths worthy. Arithmetic of a war that the truth had initiated and that the war's resolution did not resurrect. But the answer is still yes. The truth prevented a Lannister king on the Iron Throne. The truth prevented the chaos that would have followed Robert's eventual death, the succession crisis, the civil war, the fragmentation of the 7 kingdoms that the false heirs would have produced. The truth gave the kingdom a legitimate heir, Prince Jon Baratheon, the black-haired boy whose black hair was the proof that the truth had triumphed, and that the triumph's visible evidence was growing up in the Red Keep and learning to be a king. Ned Stark lived. The observation is worth noting because the alternative, the history in which Ned warned Cersei instead of Robert, in which the boar hunt proceeded, in which Robert died and Ned was arrested and Ned was executed on the steps of the Sept, was the alternative that was narrowly avoided by the decision that Ned made in the Tower of the Hand on a warm King's Landing evening, with a book of lineages and a choice between mercy for the Queen and loyalty to the King. Ned chose loyalty. The loyalty saved the kingdom. The loyalty cost blood. And the blood, like all blood spilled for truth, was the price that the truth demanded, and that the living paid, and that the living could not recover, and that the recovery's impossibility was the truth's final, permanent tax. Ned Stark sits in Winterfell. He is old now, the Northern Lord whose hair has gone grey and whose body has thickened, and whose eyes still carry the clarity that the North produced and that the South could not dim. He sits in the Godswood and thinks about Robert and thinks about Cersei and thinks about the truth and thinks about the cost, and arrives, every time, at the same conclusion. The truth was worth telling. The kingdom endured. The price was paid, and the paying, however painful, was the duty that the living owed the realm, and that the realm required, and that the requirement was the foundation on which all governance rested, the principle that the governed deserved the truth from the governors, and that the truth's cost, however high, was lower than the cost of the lie. The lie would have destroyed the kingdom. The truth merely wounded it, and the wound healed, as wounds did, leaving a scar that reminded the kingdom of what it had survived, and what it had paid, and what the paying had purchased: a legitimate king, a stable succession, and the knowledge carried in the scar's memory, and in the plaque's inscription, and in the old lord's Godswood meditations. That the truth, however expensive, was the only currency that held its value across the generations.